Come in, friend. Fire's warm, the rain's still falling. Do me a kindness, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every one. Now settle in. Let's begin. Story 1. This one came in a letter I received back in '73. A postal carrier down in the Louisiana bayou wrote it out in his own careful hand, and he asked me, plain, to keep it after he was gone. Now listen close. This is how it happened, best as I can tell it. His name was Elwood Prescott. He carried mail on Route 14 out of a low white post office in a parish called Beauregard on a Tuesday afternoon in the fall of 1971. The clock above his sorting desk had just ticked past 3, and the second hand, he later swore, hung still for the length of 2 whole breaths before it moved on. Elwood was 49 years old that fall. He had a soft belly, a bad left knee from a fall off a mail truck the year before, and a plain gold ring on his 4th finger that he had worn every day of the 22 years he had been married to a woman named Luella. He lived in a small cypress board house at the far end of a shell road, and his life, up until that Tuesday, had run the same slow and steady way for so long that he sometimes felt he was not so much living it as watching it from a chair. He rose at 4 in the morning. He drank coffee out of a chipped white mug that had belonged to his father. He put on the same gray uniform he had worn for 11 years, with the same brass name tag rubbed almost smooth at the letters, and he walked out to the same green mail truck with its cracked windshield and its dashboard smelling of hot vinyl and dust. He drove the same 72 miles of shell road and blacktop. He delivered to the same 143 mailboxes. He knew every dog by name on the route, and every dog knew him, and there was, he liked to say, a comfort in the sameness of it that he did not think other men understood. But that fall the sameness began to crack. It was small things at first. A newspaper folded on his kitchen table when he had left the paper on the porch. A pair of muddy boot prints on the linoleum floor, the shape of his own boots, but going the wrong direction, into the house from the back door when he had come in the front. A coffee cup washed and set upside down on the drying rack, when he was certain, near certain, he had left it dirty in the sink that morning. He mentioned none of it to Luella. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a way of remembering everything he said and using it against him later, gentle but firm, and he did not like to give her material. So he kept the boot prints to himself. He kept the newspaper to himself. He kept the coffee cup to himself. And he told himself, over the long, slow miles of his route, that a man of 49 years is entitled to a little forgetfulness now and again. And that was all it was. And there was nothing more to say about it. On the 16th of October, a Tuesday, he stopped at the mailbox belonging to a widow named Mrs. Aline Fontenot, out at mile 41 on the Shell Road, and she was standing there in her yard waiting for him. She was a tall, thin woman with white hair pinned up under a blue scarf, and she had lived alone in that cypress house since her husband had drowned in the bayou 19 years before. She waved him down. She came right up to the driver's window, and she looked at him with a kind of puzzled tilt to her head, the way a person looks at a photograph they cannot quite place. She said, "Elwood, I have to ask you something." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Was that you at my back door this morning, around 6? He thought about it. He drove that route in a set order, and he did not reach her mailbox until 3 in the afternoon. At 6 in the morning he was, by his own reliable memory, standing at his kitchen counter, pouring coffee from a percolator. He told her so. He told her, "No, ma'am, I was home." She looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded, slow, and she said, "Well, all right, it must have been somebody else." But he sure did have your walk on him. He drove on, and he thought about it the rest of the day, and he thought about it that night, and he thought about it lying in the dark next to Luella's slow breathing, and he could not shake it. He realized, a particular way of walking. His bad knee gave him a slight favoring of the right, a little dip in the step, and he had walked that way for over a year. It was not a thing a stranger would mimic. It was not a thing a stranger would know. The next week it was the mailbox at mile 53, belonging to a family called the Boutins. The mother came out onto the porch as he drove up. She stood there in her apron with her hands twisted in the cloth, and she called out to him, "Elwood, I fed your dog this morning." He was sitting on the porch when I woke up. He looked hungry. He did not have a dog. He had not had a dog in 9 years. He told her so, and she looked at him with a face that did not know whether to be embarrassed or afraid, and she said, "Well, it looked like the picture of yours from before, the one you used to show around." I could have sworn he drove on. His hands were shaking on the wheel. He drove 10 miles before he could work out how to breathe again. He drove those 10 miles in a strange, bright silence, the kind of silence that comes when a man's mind has, without asking his permission, gone very quiet in order to protect him. He noticed things about the road that he had never noticed before. He noticed that the yellow line down the center of the blacktop was not in fact one continuous line, but a long, careful series of dashes, and that each dash was about the length of a coffin, and that he had been driving past coffins in a slow, steady rhythm his whole life without ever once counting them. He noticed that the trees along the shoulder had all leaned the same way, west, from the prevailing wind off the Gulf, and that they leaned like a congregation bowing in the same direction for a prayer he could not hear. He noticed that his own hands on the wheel were the hands of an old man, and he was not, he told himself firmly, an old man yet. But he could see, in the way the veins stood up on the backs, and the way the knuckles had begun to thicken, that he was going to be one soon, and that not all the years he had left would be as many as he liked to imagine. He noticed, finally, that the radio in the truck was on, and that it had been on the whole time, and that he had not registered a single word of it. He listened. It was a station out of Baton Rouge. A weatherman was reading the forecast for the coming week. He was saying that there was rain likely on Friday and possible on Saturday, and that Sunday would clear and be warm for the season. It was ordinary weather on an ordinary station on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October in Beauregard Parish in the year of our Lord 1971, and Elwood Prescott gripped the wheel of a green mail truck with his old man hands, and he listened to the ordinary weather. And he told himself, with as much of his mind as he could still steer, that a man who is being replaced does not usually get told the forecast for Sunday. A man who is being replaced does not usually get to hear about the warm season. Those things, he said, in his head over and over, are for the man who stays. Now the trouble is, when a small thing starts happening to a man, and he tells himself it is nothing, and then it happens again, and he tells himself it is still nothing, there is a third time coming. there is always a third time, and he knows it deep down, and he waits for it with a low, sick feeling in the base of his stomach. And when it comes, he is somehow relieved, because at least the waiting is done. The days between were the worst of it. He kept working the route. He had to. A postal carrier does not simply stop turning up on a Tuesday because the shell road has begun to feel wrong under his tires. He rose at 4. He drank his coffee from his father's chipped white mug. He put on his gray uniform and his brass name tag, and he walked out to the green truck in the blue pre-dawn. And every morning that October, the air off the bayou smelled a little sharper than it should have, a little more like iron. He began to notice new things, small ones. He noticed that his own footprints in the dew on the front lawn always started at the porch and led to the truck in a clean straight line, but that some mornings there was a second set beside them, his own tread, his own stride, his own bad knee dip in the step, coming the other direction, as if someone with his exact way of walking had come up from the truck to the porch just before he had come down from the porch to the truck. He noticed that the fuel gauge in the mail truck did not fall the way it used to. He filled the tank on Fridays. By Wednesday, back in the summer, it would have been down to a quarter. Now, in October, by Wednesday, the needle sat at half, as if the truck were being driven fewer miles than he was driving, as if some of the miles he thought he was driving were being driven by somebody who was better at conserving fuel. He noticed that the dogs on the route had gotten quieter, not silent. They still trotted out to greet the truck. They still wagged, but they did not bark, the little, happy bark they used to bark at the sound of his engine. They only came out and stood and looked and were still, the way a dog is still when it is not entirely sure the person in the yard is the person it thinks it is. He noticed that Mrs. Aline Fontenot had begun to leave her back door open. She had never done that before. She was a widow, and she was careful. But now, when he passed the Cypress house at 3, the back door stood open a hand's width, and there was, sometimes, a coffee cup on the porch railing, and sometimes the cup was still steaming. He did not stop. He could not have said why he did not stop, but he did not. At home in the small cypress board house at the end of the shell road, Luella began to sleep poorly. She did not tell him so, but he heard her turn in the bed over and over in the small hours. He heard the mattress creak. He heard her breathe and hold and breathe again. Once, at 3 in the morning, he woke, and she was not in the bed. He found her sitting at the kitchen table in her housecoat, with the overhead light off, and only the small blue flame of the gas stove burning. She was watching the back door. She did not startle when he came in. She did not turn her head. She said, "Quiet, sugar, did you come home twice last Thursday?" He said, "No." She said, "All right." She did not ask him to sit. She did not offer to make him coffee. She only watched the back door, and after a while he went back to bed, and he lay in the dark and listened for her, and he did not hear her come back. In the morning she was at the stove making eggs, and she smiled at him, and she did not mention the night. He kept driving the route. The autumn deepened. The cypress trees along the shell road began to turn a slow, tired red. The sky over the bayou went from summer haze to the clear, cold blue of late October. The mail got heavier. Political flyers, catalogs, letters from grown children in far cities. His mail bag pulled on his shoulder more than it used to. And the small strangenesses continued, one at a time, slow enough that a man who wanted to could still tell himself none of it added up. The Booten boy, a young man of 20, home from the Navy for a week, came out to the truck on a Friday afternoon in the middle of October and stood a long moment at the driver's window before he said anything. He was tall and lean, and he had that look sailors get from being at sea too long, a certain sunburn under the eyes. He said, "Mr. Prescott, can I ask you something?" Elwood said, "Yes." The boy said, "When you delivered the mail this morning, at about 6, did you say something to me on the porch?" Elwood said, "I do not deliver at 6. I have never delivered at 6. Your box is at 45 past 3. The boy was quiet. He rubbed the back of his neck. He said, "All right." Then he stood a moment longer, and he said, "Quieter, Mr. Prescott, the man on the porch at 6 looked like you. He looked exactly like you. And he said something to me that I have not been able to stop thinking about, and I wanted to ask you if it meant anything to you before I told my mother." Elwood said, "What did he say?" The boy looked at him a long moment. Then he said, "Tell your father the practicing is nearly done." Elwood's father had been dead 19 years. He drove on. He did not remember the next 3 mailboxes. He came back to himself at mile marker 57, at the little wooden bridge over the slow black cut of Bayou Fontaine, and he pulled the truck onto the shoulder, and he got out, and he leaned on the rail and looked down at the water, and he tried very hard to breathe. The water was still. The cypress knees rose up out of it like a crowd of small hooded figures. He could see his own reflection in the black surface, or he thought he could, the shape of his shoulders, the wide brim of his uniform cap, the pale blur of his face. He leaned further. The reflection leaned further. He leaned back. The reflection leaned back. But when he took his cap off and held it out at arm's length above the water, the reflection did not take its cap off. The reflection stood there, still capped, still looking up at him with the pale blur of its face, and then, very slowly, it lifted a hand of its own without any prompting from him and waved. A postman's wave. The wave he gave every morning to the porches on his route. He got back in the truck and drove. That night he sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. He tried to write down, in order, everything he could remember about the last 6 months. He wrote April. He tried to remember what he had done in April. He remembered a hard rain one week that had flooded the low place at mile marker 63. He remembered nothing else. He tried May. He remembered nothing. He tried June, July, August. Only the vague, warm shape of them, like the memory of a room he had walked through with his eyes almost closed. He wrote September. He tried harder. He remembered dimly Luella's birthday on the 12th. He remembered a supper of a gumbo. He remembered her laughing at something he had said, though he could not remember what he had said, and he could not, when he tried, quite remember the sound of her laugh. He put the pencil down. He looked across the table at Luella, who was mending a shirt in her chair by the lamp. He watched her hands. Her hands he remembered, her hands he could have drawn from memory in the dark. Small square hands, freckled on the backs, with the thin gold band on the 4th finger of the left, and the small brown scar on the base of the right thumb from a canning accident in '59. He said, "Luella." She said, "Yes, sugar." He said, "When did I come home tonight?" She did not look up from the shirt. She said, 6:20. Same as usual. He looked at the clock over the stove. It was 10 past 9. He looked at his own wristwatch. It was 9:10. He said softly, "All right." She said softly, "All right, sugar." They did not speak of it again that evening. The next morning was a Saturday. He did not have a root on Saturday. He rose at 4 anyway. He drank his coffee. He put on his gray uniform. He walked out to the truck in the blue pre-dawn, and he drove down the Shell Road, not east toward the post office in Beauregard, but west in the opposite direction toward the far end of Route 14. He drove until he came to the leaning post and the rusted tin mailbox, and the little shotgun shack behind them. The house sat dark against the dawn. There was no smoke from the chimney. There was no light in any window. There was, however, a green mail truck parked in front of it. His truck, or the truck the man was using. It was identical. Same cracked windshield, same dashboard smell of hot vinyl and dust. He knew, without looking, that the odometer inside would read a number very close to the odometer in the truck he was sitting in. He did not get out. He sat behind his own wheel and looked at the other truck. And after a while, the front door of the shotgun shack opened, and a man came out. The man wore a gray postal uniform. He wore a brass name tag. He had a soft belly and a slight favoring of the right leg. He walked to the other truck, calm and unhurried, and he got in and he sat behind the other wheel. And he looked across the intervening 10 feet of dirt at Elwood. The two of them looked at each other. Neither of them moved. The other man's face, in the pale dawn light, was almost right. The eye on the left sat a hair too low. The mouth was a 1/4 inch too far to one side, but the rest was in place. The tired lines around the eyes, the small nick under the chin from a shaving cut a week before, the flat pale color of a man who had spent his life inside a truck cab. The other man raised his hand. He waved, a small polite wave, a postman's wave. Elwood, without meaning to, raised his own hand and waved back. The other man started his truck. The engine caught on the second turn. He pulled out slow, and he drove east down the Shell Road at a comfortable, steady pace toward the post office in Beauregard, where in a little over an hour he would sort the mail for Route 14 and load his bag and set out on his rounds. Elwood watched the tail lights recede. He sat a long time in his own truck. The sun came up over the bayou. The frogs went quiet. The first mockingbird of the morning began to sing in a live oak beside the shotgun shack. He watched it. It was a small gray bird with a white flash on its wing, and it sang the same 8 notes over and over, and it did not know or care that anything at all was strange about the man sitting in the mail truck 10 feet from its tree. After a while, Elwood put his own truck in gear, and he drove home. Elwood's third time came on the last Friday of October at a mailbox out on the far end of the route, a rusted tin box on a leaning post belonging to nobody he had ever met. The house behind it was a small shotgun shack with a caved-in porch. He had been delivering mail to that box for 11 years, and he had never once seen a person come or go from the house. The mail was always addressed to the same name, a man called P. Prescott, and Elwood had always assumed some distant cousin lived there and slept through the daylight hours. He had never questioned it. It was not his business to question the names on the envelopes he carried. He was a mailman. He delivered what was put in his hand. But that Friday, when he pulled up to the leaning post, there was a letter waiting for him inside the tin box. It was addressed to him, to Elwood Prescott, Route 14, Beauregard Parish, and it was written in his own handwriting. He sat in the truck for a long time before he took it out. The handwriting was his. He knew it the way a man knows the sound of his own voice on a tape recorder, with that same skin-crawling recognition. Every loop of the E, every slight forward slant, every little hook at the bottom of the Y. It was his hand, and he had not written it. He opened the envelope with fingers that would not stop shaking. Inside was one sheet of yellow legal paper, folded twice, and on it was written, in his same careful hand, 3 lines, "You are running behind today. You should catch up. I have been doing your route since April, and I am tired." He read it 4 times. He put it in his shirt pocket. He drove the rest of the route in a kind of dream, dropping mail into boxes without seeing the boxes, waving at porches he did not really see. He did not remember the drive home, when he pulled into his own dirt drive that evening. The sun was on the drive already down, and he could not account for the last 2 hours. He walked into his house through the front door. Luella was at the kitchen sink washing a bowl. She turned when she heard him come in, and she looked at him, and she smiled, and she said, "You're home early tonight, sugar." He said, "What time is it?" She said, 6:30, same as every night. He looked at the clock over the stove. The clock said 6:30. He looked at his own wristwatch. His watch said 8:45. He did not say anything. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put the letter on the wood in front of him, and he looked at it, and after a while, Luella came and sat across from him and read it without asking. And when she was done, she folded it back up and set it down and put her hand over his. And she said, very softly, "Sugar, whose writing is this?" He said, "Mine." She said, "When did you write it?" He said, "I didn't." She did not press him. She was a smart woman, and she had lived with him long enough to know when to talk and when not to. She got up, and she made him supper. She put a plate of red beans and rice in front of him. He ate it without tasting it. He went to bed at 9, and he lay awake staring at the ceiling until 3 in the morning, and then he got up and put on his clothes, and he took a flashlight from the drawer under the sink, and he walked out to his truck and drove down the Shell Road toward the end of the route. The house belonging to P. Prescott sat dark against a moonless sky. The bayou moved somewhere behind it, slow and thick, and the frogs and the cicadas made a wall of sound that seemed to press in from every direction. He parked the truck at the leaning post. He got out. He walked up the caved-in porch steps, and the wood groaned under his weight, and the front door of the shotgun shack was standing open by a hand's width. As if it had been left that way for him, he pushed it with the flashlight. It swung in without a sound. Inside, the shack smelled of damp wood and old paper and something else, something faint and human, like the smell of the inside of a hat that has been worn a long time. He shone the flashlight along the walls. There was a table. There was a chair. There was a narrow iron bed with a gray wool blanket folded across the foot. There were no photographs. There were no dishes. There was no sign anyone had ever lived a life in that room. But on the table, laid out neat, there was a stack of mail. He walked to the table. He shone the light down. The stack was tall, maybe 2 feet high, and every envelope in it was addressed to a house on his route. Every envelope was postmarked. Every envelope had been opened carefully along the top seam and the contents put back inside. He picked one up. It was a Sears catalog page, torn out and folded, a phone bill, an advertisement for a hair tonic, ordinary mail, mail he had delivered. He picked up another, and beneath the stack, at the bottom, folded in half and pressed flat under the weight of the others was a photograph. He unfolded it with the flashlight in his teeth. It was a photograph of him, standing on the front porch of Mrs. Aline Fontenot's cypress house at what appeared to be 6 in the morning. He was in his gray uniform. He was holding his mailbag. He was smiling at the camera, and his smile was not right. And the reason it was not right was that his face was slightly, only slightly, too wide. The mouth was a 1/4 inch too far to one side. The eye on the left was set a hair too low. The rest of him, the uniform, the bag, the bad knee lean, was correct in every detail. But the face was the face of a man who had been built from careful memory and had not quite come out right in the assembly. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in his handwriting, was one line, practicing. He heard something behind him. He turned very slowly. The flashlight beam swept across the little room, across the iron bed, across the folded wool blanket, and there, standing in the doorway of what he had taken for a closet, was a figure in a gray mail uniform. It had a mail bag over one shoulder. It had a brass name tag on the shirt. It had his bad knee lean, his soft belly, his sloping shoulders, and where its face should have been, the flashlight showed a face that was almost his, that was trying to be his, that had the mouth in the wrong place and the eye set too low. The figure did not speak. It only lifted one hand, slow, and gave him a small, polite wave, a postman's wave, the wave he gave every morning to the porches on his route. He ran. He ran out of the shack and down the caved-in steps and back to the truck, and he drove home so fast the shell road threw stones up against the underside of the truck like hail. And when he got to his own dirt drive, he left the truck, running, and stumbled into the house and locked the door and slid down against it and sat there on the floor until the first gray light came in through the kitchen window. Luella found him there at 6. She helped him up. She did not ask any questions. She led him to the bathroom and ran him a bath and put him in it, and she washed his back with a soft cloth the way she had done when he came home with the flu 20 years before, and after a long time he stopped shaking. He did not go to work that Monday, or that Tuesday, or that Wednesday, but the mail went out on the route each day. All 143 boxes received their letters on time in the correct order. Mrs. Aline Fontenot said her mail came at 3 in the afternoon, same as always. The Boutons said the same. The green mail truck moved down the shell road at its usual slow speed, and the postman inside it waved from the driver's window at every porch, and the dogs did not bark at him because the dogs still knew him. On Thursday evening, Luella sat Elwood down at the kitchen table. She had a cup of coffee in her hand, and her face was tired but calm. She said, "Sugar, I want you to listen to me carefully." He said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever is out there driving your truck, it has been driving it since April. That is 7 months. Nobody on the route has said one word. Nobody has noticed. Not Mrs. Fontenot, not the Boutons, not one soul in Beauregard Parish. Do you understand what that means?" He said, "No." She said, "It means it is doing the job. It is doing the job the way you would do it. It is being you out there on that road for 7 months, and the town is fine with it. And I want to ask you a hard question now, and I want you to think before you answer." He said, "All right." She said, "When did you come home in April?" He tried to think. He tried to remember. April was a long, fuzzy shape in his head, warm and green, with rain and mud and long, slow drives. He could not put his hand on a specific day. He could not put his hand on any specific day since April. She reached across the table. She turned his left hand over. She put her finger against his wrist, and she pressed, and he watched her face while she pressed. And after a long moment, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. She said, "Sugar, I don't feel a pulse." He looked down at his own wrist. His skin was warm. His fingers moved when he told them to. He could feel her hand on him, feel the pressure of her thumb. But when he pressed his own fingers to his own wrist, he felt nothing. No beat, no rhythm, nothing at all. He looked up at her. She said, "I have known for months. I did not want to say it. I did not want to make it real." She said, "The one out on the road, driving the truck, waving at the porches. I think that one is you. I think the one sitting in my kitchen has been someone else for a long time now, and I love him just the same. But I had to say it. I had to say it out loud." He sat very still. He looked at his own hand in hers. He looked at the plain gold ring on his fourth finger, worn smooth by 22 years, and he tried to remember the wedding, and he could not. He tried to remember his father's chipped white coffee cup, and he could not. He tried to remember his own name, and it came to him from a very great distance, as if someone else were saying it in another room. Elwood Prescott, Route 14, Beauregard Parish. Somewhere down the Shell Road, a green mail truck moved through the evening light, and its driver leaned a little to the right on his bad knee, and he waved at a porch, and the dog on that porch wagged its tail, and it was Tuesday, and the mail was on time, and the route, the beautiful long sameness of the route, kept going. He picked up his coffee cup. His hand was steady. He took a sip. He looked at his wife across the kitchen table, and he smiled at her, the smile of a man who had loved one woman for 22 years, and the smile was almost right. Almost. The mouth was a quarter-inch too far to one side. She smiled back at him anyway, because she was a good woman, because he was, in most ways, still him, because outside the rain had started up again, and the frogs were singing, and the Shell Road was long, and the route was long, and there was nothing left to do now but finish it. He said softly, "I'll be home for supper tomorrow." She said softly, "I'll set the table for two." And neither of them said what they were thinking, which was that somewhere, in a shotgun shack at the far end of the route, there was a photograph on a table, and on the back of it, in a careful hand, one word had been written, and the word was practicing, and the practicing was almost done. Story 2. A woman told me this one in Charleston, back when I was still working the mail route, and the towns were smaller than they are now. Her father had been a land surveyor up in the Colorado mountains after the war, and this is the story she said he never quite finished telling. His name was Harlan Voss. He was 34 years old in the spring of 1952, and he stood at the foot of a wooded ridge in the Rocky Mountains, 4 miles east of a town called Silver Fork, holding a folded map and a brass compass, and counting his steps up the slope one at a time. He had counted 41 steps. The 42nd step took him to a small clearing where a hunting lodge should not have been, and yet was, and he stood at its front porch for a long moment before he understood that the porch was already familiar to him. Wendell Hark. Harlan had come home from the war in '45 with a slight tremor in his right hand and a mind for numbers that he had brought with him out of the artillery. He had gone to school on the GI Bill for 2 years, learned surveying at a college in Denver, and by 52, he was working for a small firm that took contracts from mining companies and cattle outfits and the occasional railroad. He was thin, sharp-boned, quiet. He wore a tan canvas jacket with 100 pockets, and he kept a mechanical pencil behind his right ear at all times. His work in the mountains that spring was straightforward on paper. A mining concern in Denver had bought a section of high timberland east of Silver Fork, and they wanted the boundaries walked and marked. Harlan and a young assistant named Douglas Reed had ridden a truck up from town, unloaded their gear at a gravel pull-off, and set to work up the ridge. Douglas took the transit. Harlan took the chain and the compass. They meant to be up and back down inside 3 days. That first day went the way a surveyor's day is supposed to go. They worked slow. They set stakes. They ate a lunch of cold ham and hard biscuits under a stand of ponderosa pine and watched a hawk turn slow circles above the valley. They set camp at dusk in a small hollow near a creek, and Harlan lay in his canvas bedroll, listening to Douglas snore and looking up at the stars through the pine and thinking that this, in fact, was as fine a life as a man could ask for. It was the second day that the trouble began. They had staked their morning line by 10. Harlan checked the compass and made a small notation in his field book. He was standing at the base of a ridge that ran roughly north-northeast, and the section corner they meant to reach was, according to his map, 42 paces up the slope from where he stood. He had measured such distances 1,000 times in his career. He knew his own stride to within 3 inches. He set his boot on the first step, and he counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The slope was steeper than the map suggested. He felt his breath come short by the 10th step. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The pines closed in around him. The light through their needles fell in a scattered green shimmer that seemed, for a moment, to move independent of any wind. 11, 12, 13. He looked back. He could not see Douglas at the foot of the slope. He could not see the transit. He could not see any part of the world he had left 10 seconds before. 14, 15, 16. He kept climbing. He counted. He told himself, as a surveyor tells himself 100 times in a hard day's work, that a slope is a slope and a step is a step, and the numbers do not lie. At step 42, he came up over a small rise, and the trees fell back, and in front of him, in a clearing that should not have been on any map he had ever seen, stood a hunting lodge. It was a low, broad building of squared timber, dark with age. Its roof was steep-pitched and shingled in cedar. Its front porch ran the full length of the face, and the porch was floored with wide planks, worn smooth by long use. A stone chimney rose from the north end. Smoke moved out of the chimney in a slow blue thread against the sky. He knew the lodge. He knew it. He could not tell how or why or from where, but he stood at the porch steps, and he looked at the pattern of knots in the second board of the porch floor, and he felt in his chest the certain slow recognition that a man feels when he steps into a room he lived in as a child. He did not want to go inside. He did want to go inside, both things at once. He climbed the porch steps. His right hand was trembling more than usual. He put his palm flat against the front door. The wood was warm, though the day was cool. There was no smell of anything cooking, no sound of anyone within. Only the slow, steady breath of a house that has been waiting. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open. Inside, the lodge was one long room, a stone hearth at the north end with a low fire burning, a long plank table in the middle, set for one. A narrow bunk built into the south wall made up neat with a wool blanket. On the walls, mounted on plain pine plaques, were the heads of animals, 6 of them in a row. He stepped closer to the wall. The first head was an elk with a heavy rack. The second was a bighorn ram. The third was a black bear. The fourth was a mule deer buck. The fifth was a lynx. The sixth was a man. He stood a long time looking at the 6th mount. It was not a taxidermy joke or a mannequin. It was a human face, dark with age, the skin drawn tight over the bones, the mouth closed, the eyes closed, the hair still full and combed neat. It was mounted on the same plain pine plaque as the others. It had a small brass tag at the base of the plaque, and the brass tag had one word on it. The word was Harlan. He did not move. He did not breathe, or rather, he found that his body was breathing without his permission, slow and shallow, and his heart was beating in a distant, faraway way, as if it belonged to someone he had once known and only barely remembered. He turned. He walked out of the lodge. He crossed the porch. He went back down the steps and back into the pines, and he began to count, backward this time, 42, 41, 40. He walked, he counted. He kept his eyes on the ground, and he did not look up. At step 1, he came out of the trees. But the trees he came out of were not the trees he had gone into. The ridge was different. The angle of the slope was wrong. The sky was a different color, dimmer, as if the sun had moved further west than the hour allowed. And Douglas was gone. The transit was gone. Their gear was gone. The gravel pull-off, where they had left the truck, was a strip of raw earth, empty, with weeds growing up through wheel ruts that had not seen a tire in years. He stood in the middle of it, in the failing light, and he understood, in a slow, reluctant way, that something had gone quite wrong in the counting. He walked down the road towards Silver Fork. It was 4 miles. It took him a long time. The town, when he reached it, was Silver Fork. He knew the buildings. The post office with its faded green trim, the general store with the tin drink sign, the little square white church with the crooked steeple. But there were no cars on the street. There were no people on the sidewalks. The lights were off in every window. The general store had a piece of plywood nailed across the front door, and someone had written on it in white paint, "Closed for the season, come again in the spring." It was, by his own reckoning, the last week of April. Spring was already there. He walked to the sheriff's office. The door was locked. The window was dark. There was a sheet of paper stuck to the inside of the glass, and he pressed his face close and read it by the last of the daylight. The sheet was a notice, printed on official stationery, and it said that the town of Silver Fork had been formally decommissioned as an incorporated place in the state of Colorado in the fall of 1948, following the closure of the mine, and that any remaining residents were advised to relocate to the county seat. He put his hand on the glass. He read it again. 1948. 4 years before he had ever set foot in the town, he walked back out to the street. He stood in the middle of it, in the deep blue dusk, and he looked up at the ridge to the east, and there, faint against the fading sky, was the small square shape of the hunting lodge with its blue thread of chimney smoke. He sat down in the middle of the street. He put his hands over his face. He tried to think. He tried to think about Douglas Reed and where Douglas Reed had gone, and whether Douglas Reed had ever existed, and whether he himself had ever existed anywhere but on that ridge climbing those 42 steps for what might have been an afternoon or might have been a lifetime. He tried to think about the war, about the shells falling in the German field, where he had lost his hearing in the left ear for 6 months, about his mother's kitchen in Missouri, about the girl he had almost married in Denver, and each memory came to him faint and thin, like a photograph held up to a strong light. There, but not solid. There, but not his. He got up after a long time. He walked back up the road toward the ridge. He climbed. He counted. He kept his eyes on the ground. At step 42, he came up over the small rise, and the clearing was there again, and the lodge was there again, and the blue thread of chimney smoke was there again. And now, standing on the porch waiting for him, was a man. The man was thin, sharp-boned, quiet. He wore a tan canvas jacket with 100 pockets. He had a mechanical pencil behind his right ear. His right hand trembled slightly at his side, and his face was Harlan's face, exact and complete, though older, weathered by many more years than Harlan had lived. The man on the porch raised his hand in a small friendly greeting. He said, "You made it. I always wonder if you will make it. Come in. The kettle's on." Harlan climbed the porch steps. He did not seem able to stop himself. He crossed the porch and he stepped through the door. And inside, the lodge was warmer than it had been, and the plank table was now set for two. The older Harlan poured coffee from a blue enamel pot. He put a cup in front of the younger Harlan and sat down across from him and folded his hands. And he said, "I know you have questions. I had them too. I will tell you what I know, though I do not know very much." Harlan said, "How long have you been here?" The older man said, "I do not know exactly. The days do not move the way they should. I have counted the winters through the window, and I make it 31. But when I count the meals I have eaten, I make it something closer to 900. And when I count the times I have climbed those steps, I make it once." Harlan said, "The mount on the wall." The older man looked at the 6th mount on the wall. He nodded slow. He said, "That is me. That will be me. Or that is you. The tenses get slippery here. I would not think too hard about it." Harlan said, "What is this place?" The older man was quiet a long time. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the dark line of pines beyond the clearing. Finally he said, "I have a theory. It is only a theory. I think this ridge belongs to something that keeps hunters. I think it collects them. I think when I stepped up here in 52, it took me the way a man takes a fish out of a stream. I think it has kept me since. I think it is very old and very patient, and it has no hurry in it. And I think when I came here, it began to make a place for the next hunter, which is to say, for you." Harlan said, "But I am you." The older man smiled. It was a tired smile and kind. He said, "We are the same shape. We are cut from the same board. I do not know if that makes us the same man. I have had 31 winters to think about that, and I have not answered it." He said, "I am glad you are here. I have been lonely." He sat for a long time with his own name held between them, like a small strange object he had just found in his pocket. The older Harlan watched him think. He did not press. He had the patience of a man who had already had every one of these thoughts, in every one of their versions. Over the long, slow winters he had counted through the small square window of the lodge, and he was in no hurry now to hear them repeated back to him. At last the older man got up. He said, "Come, I will show you something." He led Harlan back out onto the porch. The night was full now. and the sky above the clearing was so thick with stars that Harlan had to stop for a moment on the top step and let his eyes adjust. He had not seen a sky like that since the war, since a certain November evening in a field in Belgium, when the guns had gone quiet for an hour and the men had come up out of the holes to look at the stars, because they could not quite believe there were any left. The older Harlan pointed east out, past the pines. There, in a small clear space between two tall ponderosas, was a second building, a shed. Squat and dark, roofed in the same cedar shingles as the lodge, with a single small window on its near side, the older man said, "I built that in my 6th year. I had time. I had wood. I had, more than anything, a great deal of energy that needed to go somewhere. Come, I will show you what is inside." They walked across the clearing. The grass was long and wet with dew, and it soaked Harlan's boots at once, and this small, ordinary discomfort was the most familiar thing that had happened to him in what felt like days. The older Harlan pushed open the shed door. He struck a match. He lit an oil lamp on a shelf just inside. The lamp flared and settled, and the small room came up out of the dark, and Harlan saw what was in it, and he did not, at first, understand. The shed was full of field books, stacked on shelves, piled on the floor, bundled with twine and set in careful rows. Small canvas-bound notebooks, each of them the same shape and size, each of them worn, each of them the kind of book Harlan carried in his own hip pocket every working day. There were, at a fast estimate, hundreds of them, maybe 1,000. The older Harlan said, "Quiet, one for each attempt. I number them." Harlan reached out. He took one down at random from a middle shelf. He opened it. Inside was his own handwriting, neat measurements, sketches of a slope, a count of paces. The last page of the book had a single line at the bottom. In the same hand but slightly shakier, it said, "Attempt 417. Same result. Book closed on the 83rd day. He put the book back. He took another. Same handwriting, same measurements. Same last line, only with a different number and a different count of days. He said, "Horse, you have tried 400 times to leave." The older man said, 742, actually. But 400 is when I started keeping proper books. The early ones were not disciplined. I was still young then, still angry. I did a lot of things in the first years that I would not do now. Harlan said, "What kinds of things?" The older man was quiet. He looked at the oil lamp. He said, "I walked west instead of east once. I thought perhaps the direction mattered. I walked west for 11 days. On the 11th day, I came back to this clearing from the east side, from the direction I had started, as if I had been walking in a very long circle without knowing it, as if the whole world curved back around to this lodge." He said, "I lit a fire once, in the pines. I meant to burn it all down. I thought if the lodge burned there would be nothing to keep me. The fire went out in the night. I could not tell you how. There was no rain. There was no wind. It only went out, quiet, like a candle a hand had pinched. In the morning the pines were untouched, and the lodge was untouched, and I was still here." He said, "I stopped eating once. I sat in that chair by the hearth for what I believe was 29 days. I did not weaken. I did not lose weight. I did not grow hungry. I only sat, and after 29 days I got up, and I made myself a supper of beans and coffee, and I ate it because I was tired of not eating, not because my body required it." He said, "I have not been sure for a long time that this body requires anything." Harlan looked at him. He said softly, "Are you dead?" The older man said, I do not know. I do not think that is quite the word. If I were dead, I do not think I would still be lonely. But I am lonely, so I do not think dead is the right shape of it. He said, I think we are held. That is my word for it. We are held. The way a photograph is held in a frame. The image continues. The image is even, in its way, alive. It smiles when it smiled. It holds up its hand when it held up its hand. But it does not go anywhere. It stays inside the frame. And the frame, in our case, is this clearing, and the lodge, and the 42 steps of the slope, and whatever is under all of it that has decided to keep us. Harlan sat down on the floor of the shed. He put his face in his hands. He said, I cannot do this. The older Harlan said, gently, you can. I did. I have. You will find that you can bear a great deal when the alternative is not being at all, he said. Also, you will not be alone the whole time. I will be here for a while yet, and there will be, in time, the next one. That is how it goes. There is always the next one. That is why I did not burn it down in the end. I thought about the next one coming up the slope and finding only ashes. I thought that would be worse. So I put out the fire myself before it took, and I have been putting out the fire small ways ever since, he said softly. Loneliness is not the worst of the things it does. Being unkind to the next one would be worse. I decided that a long time ago. They sat in the shed together for a while, with the oil lamp burning low, and the shelves of field books watching them like an audience of small, quiet witnesses. Then the older Harlan stood up. He put out the lamp. He said, Come, let us go back. The fire will have died. They walked back across the clearing under the enormous stars, and the wet grass soaked Harlan's boots a second time, and inside the lodge the fire had, in fact, died down to embers. The older Harlan built it up again, slow and careful, without looking, the way a man makes a fire he has made 10,000 times. He said, over his shoulder, Tomorrow I will show you the trap line. It is not for eating, since we do not seem to need to. It is for something to do, and it is a good walk. It goes east along the ridge for about a mile. There are 3 snares. You will learn to check them. You will learn to reset them. It fills a morning, and a morning that is filled is a morning that is not endured. Harlan sat down in the chair by the hearth. He watched the older man work. He said softly, Did you have a wife? The older Harlan paused. He said, I did not. I had almost married a girl in Denver. I did not quite, in the end. I have thought about her often up here. I have thought about what she would say if she knew. But she would not know. She would only know that a young surveyor named Harlan Voss did not come back from a job in the mountains in the spring of '52, and she would be, for a while, sad, and then she would go on with her life, and marry someone else, and be happy in the ordinary ways that people are happy, and I would fade from her the way a photograph fades from a mantelpiece. That is how it goes. That is one of the mercies of it. He said, She has grandchildren, I expect, by now. He said, I hope so. Harlan looked at the fire. He looked at the 6 mounts on the wall, 5 animals, and, at the end of the row, the small, still face of the older Harlan Voss, closed-eyed, waiting. He did not, quite yet, look at the empty 7th plaque with its blank brass tag. He said, quiet. What if I try to leave tomorrow? The older man said, Try. He said, What if I refuse to try? What if I just sit here? The older man said, You will sit for a while. Then you will get up and you will try. I know because I did. I know because that is what a man does. When a man has been trained to solve problems, he tries the problem. And the problem is very patient. And the problem is very willing to be tried, again and again, for as long as it takes. He said, "You are a surveyor, Harlan. You are a man who believes in the honesty of numbers. You will try to walk out. You will count your steps. You will trust your compass. And the numbers will lie to you every time. And eventually, you will stop trusting the numbers and start trusting the pines. And the pines will lie to you every time. And eventually, you will stop trusting the pines and start trusting the sky. And the sky will lie to you every time. And eventually you will run out of things to trust, and you will come back to this lodge, and you will build a shed of your own, or you will use mine, and you will fill it with your own field books, and you will wait for the next one." He said, "That is the shape of it." He said, "But it is not, in every hour, unbearable. There are good hours here. There are mornings when the mist lies in the clearing like a soft gray blanket, and the birds come, and the light is very fine, and you think, all right, this 1 hour is enough. This 1 hour is worth staying for." He said, "You will learn to count those hours, too. That is a better count than steps." The fire settled. The lodge was warm. Somewhere out in the pines an owl called, low and slow. Harlan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the older man was watching him with a kind expression, and the light in the lodge was different, and Harlan understood that he had slept, though he did not remember lying down, and did not remember dreaming, and did not know how long he had been gone. The older Harlan said softly, "Welcome to the second day." Harlan sat with his coffee. He looked at his own hand on the table. He looked at the older man's hand opposite him. Both hands had the same tremor, only the older man's was worse. The fingers curled slightly with age. Both hands wore no ring. Both hands had a small scar on the second knuckle from a piece of shrapnel in Belgium. He said, "Am I going to become you?" The older man said, "I do not know. I hope so. I hope one of us is allowed to stop, eventually, but I have hoped that for a long time." They sat together in the warm room. Outside the sun set fully. The fire in the hearth burned low. On the wall, the 6 mounts watched them with closed eyes, and the 6th mount, the one with the brass tag that said Harlan, did not move and did not open its eyes and did not need to. After a while, the older Harlan got up. He said, "I will show you your bunk." He said, "In the morning, you can climb the steps back down. You can try it. I have tried it 742 times by my count. It does not work. But you should try it. A man ought to try." Harlan followed him to the narrow bunk built into the south wall. There was a wool blanket, folded neat. There was a small pine shelf above it. On the shelf sat a mechanical pencil and a field book and a folded map. Harlan picked up the field book. He opened it. It was his handwriting, page after page of measurements, of notes on the slope, of counts. 42, 42, 42. The last entry was in a different hand, shakier, older. It said, "Wait for the next one. He will need someone to explain." He closed the book. He looked at the older Harlan. The older Harlan smiled again, and there was, this time, something almost pleading in the smile. He said, "When he comes, be kind. Do not scare him. He has walked a long way, and he does not know it yet." Then he lay down on the plank floor in front of the hearth, quiet as a man lying down to sleep in his own bed of 40 years, and he pulled his tan canvas jacket around him, and he closed his eyes. Harlan stood over him a long time. The tremor in the older man's right hand slowed, then stopped. His chest rose. Then it did not rise again. When Harlan looked up at the wall, the sixth mount was gone. The plaque was empty. The brass tag with the word Harlan was gone. There were now 7 plaques on the wall, 6 with animals. The 7th at the end of the row was empty and waiting, and its brass tag was blank, and the blank was, he understood, meant for him. Somewhere down in the valley, 4 miles down a road that no longer led to a town that no longer existed, a young surveyor in a tan canvas jacket was standing at the foot of a wooded ridge, holding a folded map and a brass compass, and setting his boot on the first step of a climb that had already been walked, and would be walked again 42 steps up into a clearing that had been waiting a long time and would wait a little longer. The kettle on the stove was still warm. He said, "And I say that not to hurt you. I say it because I was one too. I say it because I remember what it was to open a field book and feel, in the first fresh page, the small, clean promise that the world could be measured, that a slope was a rise over a run, that a corner was a corner, and a bearing was a bearing, and a chain was 66 feet, and would be, tomorrow, the same 66 feet. That is a good faith. I do not think it is a wrong faith. It has built cities. It has drawn lines on maps that men have honored, for the most part, and it has held. It is not the numbers that failed us here. It is only that we walked into a place that is older than numbers, and does not care about them, and does not intend to be measured." He was quiet a moment. He said softly, "I have wondered over the years whether the men who first walked this ridge, the men who lived here before the surveyors came, before the maps came, before the mines came, knew what to do at the 42nd step. I have wondered if they had a word for this clearing, if they warned their sons, if they simply did not come up here after a certain hour or a certain season, and the knowledge went with them when they were killed or moved off. I have thought that maybe once this was known, and then it was forgotten, and then it was for the surveyors to find again the hard way. But that is only a thought. I have no one to ask, and the clearing does not answer." He said, "So, sleep tonight. Tomorrow you will try to walk out. I will make coffee for both of us in the morning. And the day after tomorrow, if you are still here, I will show you the trap line and the little spring at the north end of the ridge where the water comes up warm even in January, and the place halfway down the west slope where, certain nights, if you sit very still, you can hear a sound like a very old bell, so faint you cannot be sure you are hearing it, and so beautiful that once you have heard it, you cannot quite stop listening for it again." Harlan sat down at the plank table and poured himself another cup of coffee, and he waited for the next one, and he wondered, as the fire burned low, how long a man could wait before he forgot he was waiting at all. The pines outside made a slow, steady sound in the dark, like the breath of something old and patient, and there was no other sound in the world. Story 3. I lived this one myself, or I think I did. My memory isn't what it was, and there are pieces of it I cannot swear to anymore. But I will tell you what I remember, and you can take from it what you take. Her name was Marceline Doon. She was 51 years old, and she took a live-in nursing position in the winter of 2023 in a small fishing village on the coast of Maine, in a saltbox house that leaned east toward the sea. Her patient was a 90-year-old woman named Iris Halloran, and on the very first evening of the very first day, Marceline noticed that Mrs. Halloran was wearing one left-handed leather glove and only the left, and never the right. Marceline had been a nurse for 28 years. She had worked in hospitals, in nursing homes, in the private houses of the wealthy and the private trailers of the poor. She had seen every eccentricity a body can carry, and she had learned long ago that the best care is quiet care, and that a nurse who does not ask about the small strange habits of her patients will be told about them in time, when the patient wishes to speak. She was a tall, angular woman with strong hands and a soft, plain face. Her hair was going gray at the temples. Her husband had died 3 years earlier of a bad heart, and she had sold the house they had shared in Portland and taken to doing live-in work because empty rooms had begun to press on her at night, and she found she could not sleep well in them any longer. The Halloran place was a good house for her. It was small and neat and full of ordinary sounds, the tick of a mantel clock, the settling of old timber, the far low mumble of the tide on the rocks below the bluff. Iris Halloran was frail but sharp. Her mind was still there behind her pale, watery eyes, and she liked to talk in the evenings. At the kitchen table, over a cup of black tea that Marceline steeped strong the way the old woman preferred. They took to each other quickly. It was that kind of house. The left glove came off only once a day at bath time, and Iris insisted on doing the bath alone. Marceline waited outside the bathroom door with a folded towel and a fresh nightgown, and she heard, through the wood, the small sounds of the old woman moving in the water. And always, before Iris called her back in, she heard the soft creak of leather and knew that the glove was going back on. For the first 3 weeks, Marceline did not ask. She noticed other things, small, ordinary strangenesses. Mrs. Halloran always ate with her left hand. She wrote with her left hand. She wound the mantel clock with her left hand, using a small key kept on a hook by the fireplace. She did all of these things, in fact, exclusively with the left. Her right hand rested in her lap or on the arm of her chair, gloveless, pale, still. Its fingers did not curl. Its skin did not seem entirely the same color as the rest of her. Marceline did not think at first that it was ill. It was only different. On the 22nd night, they were sitting together in the front parlor by the wood stove, and Iris looked up from her tea and said, "You have been polite for 3 weeks, Marceline, and I appreciate a polite woman. But you are wondering about the glove." Marceline set down her cup. She said, "I have wondered." Iris smiled. Her teeth were her own, small and yellowed and complete. She said, "When I was 14 years old in this house, my mother died in the room above us. She died in the middle of the night, and I sat with her body until morning because my father was down the coast and could not be reached. And in that long night, sitting in a wooden chair holding my mother's hand, something happened to me that I have never quite understood. But it began in the right hand, and it is why I wear the left glove." Marceline waited. Iris looked at her right hand, resting in her lap. She said softly, "Have you ever held the hand of the dead, dear?" Marceline said, "Many times. It is part of the work." Iris nodded. She said, "Then you know that a dead hand cools. And you know that at some point, in the hour after, the hand begins to feel less like a hand and more like a shape. That is the word I used at 14, a shape. It did not feel like my mother anymore. And I remember thinking quite clearly that I did not want my hand to become a shape one day. I did not want to be a shape. And when I thought that, my mother's right hand, which I was holding with my left, moved. She stopped. Marceline said gently, moved how Iris said it closed. Not all the way, only a small tightening of the fingers around my left hand, enough that I felt it, enough that I could not later tell myself I had imagined it. And in that same moment I felt something pass from her hand into my hand, like a small warm current. It was not pleasant. It was not unpleasant. It was only a thing that happened. And then her hand relaxed again, and it was cold, and it was a shape, and the current was in my hand instead, my right hand, where it has been ever since. She lifted the right hand slightly, as if to demonstrate. Marceline looked at it. It rested pale and still on her thigh. Iris said, "The right hand has not aged the way I have. That is what the glove hides. I put the glove on my left hand instead of my right because the right does not want to be covered. It becomes restless in a glove. It taps. It scratches. It wakes me at night. So I glove the left, which is the ordinary hand, and I keep the right free and cold and still, and we have an understanding, the right hand and I. It stays quiet as long as I let it breathe." She said all of this in a plain, calm voice, the voice of a woman describing the weather, and when she was done, she picked up her teacup with her left hand and took a small sip and looked at Marceline over the rim of it and waited. Marceline said, at last, "Iris, I do not know what to say." Iris said, "You do not have to say anything. I have not told anyone since my father, and he did not believe me, and he is dead now 63 years. I only wanted you to know because you are staying in the house, and you have a right." That night, Marceline lay in her narrow bed in the back room and listened to the tide. She was not frightened, or she was, but the fear was thin and quiet, the way an old story frightens you at 3 in the afternoon in a warm kitchen. She thought about Iris's right hand, pale and still, and she thought that 90 was very old, and that 90-year-olds tell many stories, and that a nurse who does her work well does not need to sort truth from softness in her patients' tales. She rolled over, and she slept. In the morning, she was making coffee at the stove, and she noticed that her own right hand was cold. She rubbed it against her leg. She held it above the burner. It warmed a little. She thought nothing of it. The house was drafty, and the winter was hard that year, and cold hands were the least of the small aches of 51. But over the following days, the cold in her right hand did not go away. She noticed she was doing more things with her left, buttoning her sweater, stirring soup, picking up the mail from the mat inside the front door. It was a small drift, so small she did not, at first, mark it. She marked it on a Thursday. She was writing a letter to her sister in Ohio at the kitchen table, and she had been writing for perhaps 10 minutes when she looked down at the page and saw that the handwriting was her handwriting, and it was neat, and it slanted the correct way, and it was being made by her left hand. Her right hand was resting in her lap, pale still. Cool. She put the pen down. She flexed the fingers of her right hand. They flexed. They obeyed. There was no pain, no numbness, only a stillness, a reluctance, as if the hand were content where it was and did not care to be summoned. She thought about calling her doctor in Portland. She did not. That evening she asked Iris at the parlor stove, "Iris, does the house do this to people?" Iris was working a piece of knitting one-handed, her left hand deft as a spider, her right resting on the arm of the chair. She did not look up. She said mildly, "The house does not do it, dear. I do not think anything does it. It is only in the air here. It is only in old houses by the sea where somebody died the wrong way once, and it looks for the next quiet hand. She said, softly, I am sorry, Marceline. The apology sat in the air between them a long time. The fire in the wood stove ticked. Somewhere below the bluff, a wave broke and drew back. Marceline sat very still in her chair, and she looked at Iris, and Iris looked at her knitting, and neither of them said anything more that night. Marceline went to bed at 10. She lay awake until 2. She listened to the tide. She listened to the mantel clock in the front parlor. She listened, hardest of all, to her own right hand resting on the coverlet at her side, and to the small, quiet nothing of it, its faint, cool patience. In the morning she got up and made coffee. She used her left hand. She did not think about it. She only noticed when the coffee was made and the cup was in front of her at the little kitchen table that she had not once, in the preparing of it, reached for anything with her right. She thought about her husband, who had died 3 years earlier. She thought about how a person accommodates a change without quite marking it. She thought about how, after his heart had failed him on a summer afternoon in Portland, she had come home from the funeral and had lived in their house another 6 months before she had realized she had stopped sleeping on his side of the bed. She had not decided to stop. She had only stopped. And then one Tuesday morning she had noticed the untouched pillow on the far side of the mattress, and she had wept for an hour, quiet, into her coffee, because grief is a slow tenant, and it moves in without asking, and it does not always let you see it moving in. She thought that whatever was happening in her right hand was moving in that way. She did not tell Iris. She did not tell her sister in Ohio. She did not tell the young doctor who came out from town every second Wednesday to check on Iris's blood pressure. She only continued to work and continued to notice and continued, in the small ways, to accommodate. She began, in the second week of December, to knit. She had never been a knitter. She had watched her mother knit as a girl, and she had learned the basic stitches at a summer camp when she was 11, but she had not held needles in her hands since. Now, one afternoon, sitting in the parlor while Iris napped in the chair by the stove, Marceline felt in her hands a small, strong urge, and she looked around, and she saw Iris's knitting basket on the low table by the chair, and she took up the needles and the yarn, and she began. Her hands knew what to do. Her left hand held the needle. Her right hand fed the yarn. She did not think. She did not consult a pattern. She worked, and after 20 minutes she had knit 5 neat rows of a stitch she did not know the name of. She stopped. She looked at what she had made. It was the beginning of a leather glove, or the shape of one. A small, careful cuff for the left hand in the same dark wool that Iris had been using. Marceline stared at it. Then she pulled the needles out and undid the stitches, one after another, and rewound the yarn onto its ball, and put the whole thing back in Iris's basket. She did not tell Iris. That night at supper, Iris said mildly, "You have been busy today, dear," Marceline said. "Only a little laundry," Iris said. Ah! She did not press. She never pressed. Iris had always been a woman who let you keep your small silences, and it was one of the things Marceline liked best about her, and it was one of the things Marceline understood in that moment that had made her linger in the leaning salt box on the bluff long past the point where a wiser woman would have packed a bag and driven south. Iris was easy. Iris was kind. Iris was, for a woman with a strange hand and a stranger story, extraordinarily good company. And Marceline had been lonely a long time. She wondered, sometimes, in the small hours, whether the loneliness had made her a good candidate, whether the house looked for lonely women, whether the right hand knew. Somehow, when it had found one whose empty rooms had begun to press, she did not know. She could not know. She only knew that on the nights when she thought of leaving, she did not, in the end, quite want to, and that, on the mornings when she thought of calling her doctor in Portland, she did not, in the end, quite pick up the phone. The days shortened. The bay went from gray-blue to iron-gray to a sullen black-green. The first snow came on the 18th of December, a small, polite snow that whitened the shingles of the salt box and the rocks below the bluff and did not last. The second snow came on Christmas Eve and lay a foot deep by morning, and Marceline and Iris ate a Christmas dinner of roast chicken and cornbread stuffing at the kitchen table, and Iris drank a small glass of sherry, and Marceline drank two, and they told each other small ordinary stories about the men they had once loved, and Iris laughed twice, quiet, dry, small laughs, and it was, Marceline thought later, one of the good days. That night she took her bath before bed, and when she stepped out of the tub and told herself dry, she stood in front of the small oval mirror above the sink, and she looked at her right hand. The skin was paler than it had been. Not much. Only enough that, if you had known her hand as she had known it for 51 years, you would have noticed. The veins on the back of the hand were slightly less visible. The knuckles were smoother. It was not the hand of a younger woman. It was, she thought, the hand of a woman whose hand had stopped doing certain things and had begun to look, as a result, less used. She flexed the fingers. They flexed obediently at their normal speed. There was no lag, but when she pressed her palm to the mirror to look at the pale mark left on the glass, her right palm left no mark. There was no smear of moisture, no warm ghost of skin. The mirror stayed cold and dry where her right hand had touched it. Her left hand, when she tried the same, left a clear print of condensation that faded slowly. She stood a long moment. Then she washed her right hand carefully with soap and warm water, and she dried it, and she went to bed. In January, Iris grew brighter. Marceline had noted the beginnings of it in December, but January was the month it became undeniable. Iris walked without the cane. Iris sat up later in the evenings. Iris took the sherry every night now, a small glass, and it did not seem to slow her mind or thicken her tongue the way sherry had used to do in the fall. Her right hand, at rest in her lap, began to have color. Not much, a hint of pink at the base of the thumb, a slight warm tone in the palm. Enough that on the 8th of January, when Marceline was helping Iris into bed and briefly touched the back of the old woman's ungloved right hand, she found that it was warm. The left hand, still in its leather glove, was cool. Marceline did not say anything. That was the night she saw her reflection lag. That was the night. The reflection's left hand rose a half-second after her own, and lowered a half-second after her own, and did all its small motions with a small delay, and Marceline sat on the edge of the bed with her face in her left hand and understood quite clearly that she had crossed a line she had not seen and that could not be uncrossed. She thought about Iris's story again, about the 14-year-old girl sitting up all night with her dead mother's hand in her own, about the small, warm current passing from one hand to the other. She thought that a current, once it starts, needs somewhere to go. She thought that when Iris died, because Iris would die, 90-year-olds do, the current would need a place, and it would already know its place, because it had been moving in for weeks. She thought all of this, and she did not, still, pack her bag. She thought about her sister in Ohio. Her sister was a good woman, kind, married to a good man, with 2 grown daughters. Her sister would take her in. Her sister had said so 3 years earlier at the funeral. "You come to us anytime, Marcy." Anytime. She thought about her sister's house, warm and full of grandchildren at Christmas, and she thought about the years it would take to explain to a sister who loved her plainly what had happened to her right hand. She would not be able to explain it. She would only be able to hide it. She would eat with her left. She would write with her left. She would wear, perhaps, a glove. And her sister's husband, and her sister's grown daughters, and the small, loud grandchildren would notice, slowly, over years, that Aunt Marcy did everything with the left, and never the right, and one of them would ask, eventually, and Marceline would have to say something. She thought about that conversation. She could not imagine getting through it. She thought then, and it was the first time she had let herself think it, that maybe the leaning salt box on the bluff was the kindest place she could be, that maybe there were houses in the world that had been built for people like her, that maybe Iris had been one of those people, and Iris's mother had been one of those people, and Iris's mother's mother had been one of those people, and the house had held them all, and had asked, in return, only that they not run from it. She thought this at 3 in the morning on the 9th of January, with the mantel clock ticking in the parlor, and the tide low and quiet below the bluff. Then she got up, and she went to the kitchen, and she made herself a cup of black tea, using her left hand, and she took it to the front parlor, and she sat in Iris's chair by the wood stove, and she waited for the dawn. Her right hand rested in her lap, pale and cool. She looked at it for a long time. She said softly to no one, "All right, all right." The dawn came in slow. First a thinning of the black outside the parlor window, then a pale gray along the horizon over the water, then the first hint of that cold pink that a Maine winter sunrise gives you on a good, clear morning. Marceline sat in Iris's chair and watched it. She held her teacup in her left hand. Her right hand rested in her lap, palm up, the way Iris's had rested for the 60-plus years since she was 14. She thought about the little writing desk in the corner of Iris's bedroom and the small leather-bound diary Iris kept in the top drawer of it, and the way Iris wrote in that diary every night before bed, one careful page, in her left hand, in a small, precise script. Marceline had never read the diary. She would not ever read the diary. But she wondered, sitting there in the pink dawn, whether the diary would tell her, if she did, that Iris had also once sat in this chair at 3 in the morning with her right hand palm up in her lap, and had said softly, to no one, "All right, all right." She thought that it probably would. She thought about that word, inheritance. It was a word she had grown up with in a plain way, a farm, a set of dishes, a small sum in a bank account. She had not, until that morning, thought of it as the kind of word that could describe what was moving through her right hand. But that was what it was. An inheritance, passed from a 14-year-old girl to a 51-year-old nurse across 60-plus years of a life, through no paperwork and no ceremony and no lawyer, only through the willingness of a lonely woman to sit at a kitchen table in a leaning salt box on a bluff and drink black tea and let the house have her. She understood, all right with that. She would not be all right with it every day. There would be, she knew, days when the strangeness would rise up in her chest like a wave and she would want to run. But this morning, sitting in the pink dawn, she was all right. And she thought that all right on any given morning was more than most people got. The right hand did not move, but she felt distinctly that it hurt her. Marceline did not go home. She could have. She had savings enough. She had a sister in Ohio. She had still in a bank account in Portland the money from the sold house. She could have packed a bag that night and driven south by morning and never looked back at the leaning salt box on its bluff. She did not. She could not entirely say why. She told herself over the days that followed that she had made a commitment, that Iris needed her, that the money was good and the house was warm and the coast was beautiful in the winter light. All of these things were true. But underneath them was another thing, a thing she did not like to hold up to the light, which was that her right hand was no longer entirely afraid of what was happening to it. It was, in fact, becoming curious. It rested in her lap in the evenings, and she felt in it a slow, patient attention, as if it were listening to the house, as if it were waiting for the house to speak to it. The other thing that kept her, though she did not admit this to herself either, was Iris. Because Iris, in those weeks, began to change. The old woman grew brighter. Her cheeks took on color. She slept less and talked more. She began to walk without her cane, small, careful steps at first, then whole trips across the parlor floor. Her eyes lost some of their watery pale and took on a sharper blue. She looked, in a way Marceline could not put a word to, younger. Not physically younger, not in any way you could photograph, but younger in the sense of a woman rising up out of a long tiredness, gathering herself, and the right hand of Iris Halloran, ungloved, still pale, still cool, began, very occasionally, to move the first time. Marceline saw it out of the corner of her eye. She was standing at the kitchen sink washing a plate, and Iris was in the parlor chair by the stove. And in the mirror above the sink, Marceline saw the old woman's right hand rise slow from the arm of the chair and turn slightly, palm up, as if to catch something falling from the ceiling. It held there for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it lowered again, and settled, and was still. Iris did not seem to know it had moved. Truss. Marceline said nothing. But that night, when she was undressing for bed in her back room, Marceline looked in the small mirror above her dresser and saw that her own reflection was 1/2 second slow. She raised her left hand to brush a strand of hair from her face, and the reflection raised its left hand, but not at the same moment. A hair of delay, a single lagging beat. Then it caught up and looked back at her, and the reflection's face was her face, and it was tired, and it was a little frightened. She put her hand down. The reflection put its hand down at the right time. She looked at her right hand. Her right hand hung at her side, quiet, pale, cool. She lifted it. It lifted a full 1/2 second before the reflection's right hand lifted. She lowered it, slow. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She put her face in her hands. Or rather, she put her face in her left hand. Her right hand rested on her knee, palm up, as if to catch something falling from the ceiling. In the spring, although the calendar said February, and she could not later remember any of March, or April, or the first 2 weeks of May, so what she thought of as spring was likely much later. Iris Halloran passed one afternoon in the parlor chair. She simply did not wake from her nap. Her left hand rested in her lap, wearing its leather glove. Her right hand was folded softly on top of it, ungloved, pale, still. She had, in her last months, become almost girlish. Her cheeks were pink. Her hair had gone in some places from white back to a soft honey gray. She had been, at the end, quite beautiful in a way Marceline had not expected. Marceline sat with her a long time. It was afternoon light. The tide was low. The mantel clock ticked in its slow, steady way, and out over the water a gull cried once, and then was quiet. Marceline held Iris's hand. She held the left, the gloved one. She did not touch the right, and the right, she was certain, although she could not have said how, was grateful. She sat until the light went blue in the windows, and then she got up, and she took the mantel clock key off the little hook by the fireplace, and she wound the clock. She used her left hand. Her right hand rested at her side, pale, still, cool. There was paperwork to do, and Marceline did it. There was a funeral home in the village, and Marceline called them. There was a niece in Boston, and Marceline reached her, and the niece was tearful and kind and thanked her for her care. There was, in the days that followed, a small, quiet service in the small, square church at the top of the village, and Marceline stood at the back in a black wool coat and listened to a young minister say gentle things about a woman he had not really known, and she left before the coffee. And then she went back to the leaning salt box on the bluff. She did not leave. Her savings were her savings. Her sister in Ohio was her sister in Ohio. The house had been left, by Iris's careful will, to a trust that permitted its live-in caretaker to remain as long as she wished, in exchange for maintenance and a small annual fee that Marceline could easily pay. The niece in Boston was glad to have someone in the house. The village accepted her the way small villages accept a nurse who has stayed on. In the general store, they called her Mrs. Doone. At the post office, they saved her mail behind the counter. In the little cafe by the harbor, they knew she took her coffee black and her toast with butter and no jam. She lived there a long time. She wore, from that spring on, a single left-handed leather glove, and only the left and never the right. She wound the mantel clock with her left hand, using the same small key on the same small hook. She ate with her left hand. She wrote her letters with her left hand. And in the long evenings, in the parlor chair by the wood stove, her right hand rested in her lap, pale, still, cool, and she felt in it a slow, patient attention that she had grown over the years to find companionable. She lived alone, but she was not lonely, because there was the tide and the mantel clock and the settling of the old timber and, of course, her right hand, which she thought of on some nights as the last remaining piece of a woman named Iris Halloran, and on other nights as the first arriving piece of something else that had not yet decided what to be called. When she was 71 years old, a young hospice nurse arrived at the leaning salt box on the bluff, sent by an agency to sit with a woman named Mrs. Doone, who was declining now and who could no longer manage on her own. The young nurse was a tall, angular woman with strong hands and a soft, plain face, and her name, though it does not matter here, was a good and ordinary name. On the first evening, over black tea at the kitchen table, the young nurse noticed that Mrs. Doone was wearing one left-handed leather glove, only the left, never the right, and Mrs. Doone looking across the table at the young nurse's warm, ungloved hands, smiled a slow, patient smile, and did not say anything about it. Not that night. There was, after all, no hurry. The right hand knew how to wait. Story 4. The man who told me this one died the following spring. I never learned if that was connected. He was a long-haul trucker who had run the same routes for 30 years, and he told me this in a truck stop diner in Kansas at 2 in the morning, and he made me swear I would not put his real name in it. I have kept that promise. The rest is his. His name, for our purposes, was Buck Renner. He was 58 years old, and on a warm September night in 1994, he was driving a loaded tractor-trailer west across the Kansas prairie on a 2-lane state highway in the second hour after midnight when he came around a slow, long bend and saw in the wash of his headlights a road crew paving fresh asphalt in the middle of the empty land. There were no work lights. There were no signs. There was no flagger with a lantern. There was only a long, low strip of black asphalt, still steaming, and a crew of 6 men in dark coveralls standing at the shoulder, watching him come. He stood on the brake. The trailer settled behind him with a slow, deep hiss, and the truck came to a stop maybe 40 yards short of the crew. And he sat there with his hands on the wheel, and the crew stood there on the shoulder, and no one moved for what felt like a long time. Buck had been driving trucks since he was 22 years old. He had run mail routes, produce routes, cattle routes. In the 80s, he had done a hard 3-year stretch for a chemical company that had eaten his marriage. Since '89, he had run long-haul dry freight for a small outfit out of Topeka, and he liked the work. He liked the empty roads at night. He liked the low mumble of the engine and the smell of the dashboard heater, and the way a man's own thoughts would rise up in him on a long, dark drive, honest and slow, without the interference of the day. He was a big man, with a broad, flat face and small, careful eyes and hands the size of dinner plates. He wore a red plaid jacket in the winter and a plain gray work shirt in the summer. And he kept a small photograph of his daughter, grown now, married, in Wichita, clipped to the sun visor on the driver's side. He drove the same 912 miles every week. He drove them so many times he could tell you, in his sleep, the exact mile marker where the elm tree leaned over the road, and the exact mile marker where the coyote ran out the 3rd Tuesday of every April, and the exact mile marker where you had to slow for a low place that flooded in the spring. He knew this road the way a man knows his own kitchen. There had never been, in the 15 years he had run it, a fresh strip of paving in the middle of the prairie at mile marker 287. There had never been a road crew at midnight in a place where there was no road to work on. There had never been 6 men in dark coveralls standing quietly on a shoulder, watching a truck come round a bend. He put on his 4-way flashers. He rolled the window down. The air smelled of hot tar and something else, something faint and organic like turned earth. He called out, "You boys all right out here?" The men on the shoulder did not answer. They only looked at him. Their faces were shadowed by the brims of their caps, and the caps had no logo, and the coveralls had no company name across the back. He counted them. 6. They stood in an even line, evenly spaced, and they did not shift their feet or scratch their necks or do any of the small, restless movements a working man does when he is standing still. He said, louder, "You need me to go around. One of the men lifted an arm. He pointed down the fresh asphalt strip, west, in the direction Buck was already headed. The gesture said, "Plain as day, go on. Keep going." Buck sat for another long moment. Then he put the truck in gear and rolled forward, slow, onto the fresh paving. The tires made a soft, sticky sound. The asphalt was still warm. As he passed the crew on the shoulder, they did not turn their heads. They only stood and watched the truck pass, and when he looked in his side mirror, the 6 of them were still standing there, evenly spaced, evenly still, and the mirror showed only their backs, because they had not turned, and their backs were the same as their fronts, which is to say, dark coveralls and unmarked caps, and the faint suggestion of a face somewhere beneath the brim. He drove. The fresh strip ran by his odometer for 2.5 miles. Then the road returned to the old cracked blacktop he knew. He kept driving. He crossed into the next county at 3:17 a.m. He fueled up at a Sinclair station in Colby at 4. The clerk was a young girl who did not look up from her paperback novel. He paid cash. He got back in the truck and he drove. He told himself over the next 200 miles that he had seen a highway crew doing a night pour. That was all. Kansas Department of Transportation, state budget, overtime work. He told himself that they had been quiet because they were tired. He told himself that the coveralls had probably had logos he had missed in the dark. He told himself, mile by mile, that a man of 58 who drives at night sees strange things sometimes, and there is nothing to be gained by dwelling on any of them. He told himself all of this. He almost believed it. On the return trip, 3 days later, he came around the same long bend at roughly the same hour of the night, and the fresh strip of asphalt was gone. Not paved over, not aged, gone. The old cracked blacktop ran uninterrupted through the mile he was certain, absolutely certain, had been fresh paving. He slowed. He crawled the truck along at 5 miles an hour. He looked for tar splatter on the shoulder. He looked for the little wooden stakes a crew leaves behind. He looked for the deep tire ruts of a paver. He saw nothing. He saw the same prairie he had seen for 15 years, the same barbed wire fence, the same telephone poles marching west, the same low humps of grass. He drove on. He did not tell anyone. The next 2 weeks were a strange kind of quiet. He worked. He drove his usual routes. He slept in the sleeper cab at truck stops, and in a small furnished room he kept in Topeka, and he ate diner meals at counters and listened to country radio in the cab and did all the small, ordinary things of his life the way he had done them for 30 years. And underneath the ordinariness he waited, in that low, sick way a man waits for a thing he cannot name. And he told himself over and over that he had seen a road crew doing a night pour. He drove up to Wichita on a Sunday to see his daughter. Her name was Kay. She was 34 years old, married to a decent, quiet man named Tom, who worked for the county assessor's office, and she had a small brick house on a corner lot with a chain-link fence and a good yard. She made him a Sunday supper of pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans, and she poured him a glass of iced tea, and she asked him, casual, how the routes were treating him. He said, same as ever. She said, you look tired, Daddy. He said, I am always tired. That is the job, she said. You look more tired than that. He drank his tea. He looked at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, that particular hazel, and she had his big flat hands, and she had, above all, her own steady, patient way of looking at a person when she wanted them to say more than they wanted to say. He had never been able to lie to her comfortably, even when she was a small child and she had asked him if her mother was going to come back. This was the summer after the divorce, when she was 7. He had not been able to lie. He had said, "Quiet, no, honey, I don't think she is." And she had cried, and he had cried, and they had sat on the back porch of the little house he was renting then and looked at the sky, and they had not lied to each other since. He said, "Kay, I have been seeing something on the road that I do not know how to explain." She said, "Tell me." He told her. He did not tell her all of it. He told her about the road crew. He told her about the fresh strip that appeared and disappeared. He did not tell her about the boots that were too clean, and he did not tell her about the version of him that had turned in the side mirror. He told her enough, and she listened, and she did not interrupt, and when he was done, she reached across the kitchen table and put her hand on his. She said, "Daddy, are you sleeping enough?" He said, "No." She said, "Are you drinking?" He said, "No." She said, "Are you seeing a doctor?" He said, "No." She said, "All right, all right." Well, sometimes when a person is tired and doing long hours in the dark and getting older, they see things. That is a normal thing. It does not mean anything bad. It only means you need to rest. He said, "I know." She said, "Will you take some days off?" He said, "I will try." She said, "Do you want to sleep here tonight? We have the guest room. It has clean sheets. You can stay a week if you want." He said, "No, sweetheart. I need to get back. I have a run tomorrow." She looked at him a long moment. Then she got up, and she came around the table, and she hugged him. She was a small woman, and he was a big man, and she had to reach up to put her arms around his neck. And she did it the way she had done it as a child, standing on the tops of his boots. He held her a long time. He could smell her shampoo. He could feel the small, quick beat of her heart against his chest. And he thought quite clearly that if he never saw her again, he would have this. He would have this last hug in the kitchen of her small brick house on a Sunday evening in the fall of 1994. And it would be, in whatever came next, enough. He drove back to Topeka that night. He did not sleep. He watched the road. The next run took him west along the state highway. He fueled up in Topeka at 11 at night. He climbed into the cab. He put the truck in gear. He drove. He had told himself on the long, slow miles between Topeka and Salina that he would not look at the shoulder at mile marker 287. He would keep his eyes on the road. He would sing along with the radio. He would think about Kay. He would think about the granddaughter he did not yet have, but suspected was coming. From a small comment Kay had made over supper and had not quite finished. He would think about anything but the fresh strip of asphalt. But when he came around the long, slow bend at 1:40 in the morning, he looked. There was no fresh strip. The old cracked blacktop ran clear and empty in the wash of his headlights. There was no crew on the shoulder. There was no steaming asphalt. There was only the prairie and a moon and the low ranks of barbed wire fence marching west. He drove through the mile at his normal speed. His hands on the wheel were shaking very slightly, and he could not tell whether from relief or from something else. The next 2 runs, same thing, empty road, no crew, no fresh strip. He began cautiously to hope on the 4th run at 2:20 in the morning. He came around the bend, and the strip was there again. Steaming, fresh, and the 6 men were there again, evenly spaced on the shoulder, silent, watching. Only this time there were 7. He counted them twice. He was sure. 6 had become 7. They stood evenly spaced along the shoulder, and the new one was second from the left. And he was, so far as Buck could tell in the pass of the headlights, no different from the other 6. Dark coveralls, unmarked cap, smooth incomplete face under the brim. Buck did not stop. He rolled past them at a crawl, watching. None of them turned. None of them lifted an arm. They only stood 7 now and let him pass, and in the side mirror he saw them recede, evenly still, evenly quiet. He drove the rest of the run in a kind of numb, steady terror. He thought about what the 7th man meant. He thought that maybe the crew grew, that maybe another driver, some other man on some other stretch of road, had also come around a bend and been shown a fresh strip that did not exist, and had also, for reasons he could not name, kept driving through it, and had also seen his own face in the shoulder line one night, and had made his handoff, and had joined. He thought then that there might be a lot of these crews, on a lot of roads, standing on a lot of shoulders, growing one man at a time over the years and the decades. He thought that maybe every American highway had one somewhere. If you knew where the long, slow bend was, he drove, he tried, after that, to break the pattern in every way he could think of. He tried driving through the mile in daylight. Nothing there. He tried driving through it at exactly the same hour every night. Sometimes it was there. Sometimes it was not. He tried driving through it in bad weather, in good, in summer, in winter. He tried driving it with the radio on, with the radio off. He tried driving it with a can of beer on the dashboard, though he was not a drinker, only to see if his state mattered. It did not. The strip appeared when the strip appeared. There was no pattern he could find. He tried, once, calling the State Highway Department. He drove to a payphone in Salina and put in a call, using his real name, and asked, casual, whether they had done any night paving on the state highway west of Salina in the last year. The clerk on the other end took his name. She checked. She was gone a long time. She came back, she said, "Sir, we have no record of any paving on that stretch since 1982. He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Yes, sir. The road has not been touched. It is on our list for resurfacing in 96, but that has not been funded yet." He said, "All right. Thank you." He hung up the phone. He stood in the payphone booth a long moment. He watched a woman across the street loading groceries into a station wagon. She was a plain woman in her 40s, with a baby on her hip, and she was laughing at something the baby had done, and the baby was laughing back. And it was, he thought, the most beautiful, ordinary thing he had ever seen. He drove home. He slept for 6 hours. He ate a plate of eggs. He got back in the truck. The winter came on. The prairie went hard and brown and then white. And the state highway kept its long, slow bend at mile marker 287, and Buck kept driving it, and sometimes the fresh strip was there, and sometimes it was not. He counted the crew each time he passed. 7 in November, 7 in early December, 8 one bad night in January, when a low ground fog lay across the shoulder, and he had to count the shapes by their caps against the paler dark of the sky. 8 in February, 9 by the middle of March. Each time he looked hard for a face he could name. He was not sure why. He thought that if he could identify one of them, a driver he had known, a hauler he had shared a booth with at a truck stop in Amarillo, then he could tell someone. He could go to the man's family. He could say, "Quiet. Your husband, your father, your brother is on a shoulder, at mile marker 287, and he is not coming home, and I am sorry. He thought it would be a kind of service he could do if he could only identify one of them. But their faces were always smooth in the way a face is smooth in a photograph, slightly wiped by a wet thumb. He never could quite fix a name to any of them, except, of course, for the middle one. The middle one he could always name. The middle one was him, and he understood, driving through the Strip on a cold, clear night in early April, that there was no service to do for the middle one, because the middle one's family was Kay in Wichita, and Tom, and the little granddaughter Kay had, after all, been carrying that Sunday supper in the fall, a small girl now 9 months old named after Buck's mother. He thought about calling Kay. He thought about it every run. He did not. He did, one night in April, pull off at the payphone in Salina and dial her number. She picked up on the third ring. She said, "Daddy, everything all right?" He said, "Yes, sweetheart, everything's all right. I only wanted to hear your voice," she said. "Are you sure?" He said, "I am sure. Kiss the baby for me. Tell Tom I said hello." She said, "Daddy, come for supper this Sunday." He said, "I will try." He did try. He drove down to Wichita on the Sunday. He held the baby. He ate Kay's pot roast. He did not tell her anything. He drove back to Topeka on the Monday and got in the truck on the Tuesday and turned west on the state highway at 11 that night, and around the long, slow bend at mile marker 287, the fresh strip was waiting for him, and the middle spot on the shoulder was empty, and he knew then that his time was near. 2 weeks later he came around the bend at 1:30 in the morning, and the fresh strip was there again, same length, same steam, same 6 men in dark coveralls on the shoulder, same silent lift of the arm from one of them, pointing west, meaning, "Go on." He drove through it. He looked hard, this time, at the men as he passed. Their faces, under the brims, were smooth, not featureless. He could see the suggestion of eyes, of a mouth, but smooth in the way a face is smooth when you look at it in a photograph that has been slightly wiped by a wet thumb. Nothing you could name, nothing you could point at, only a sense that the details were not quite committed. He drove, he fueled up at the Sinclair in Colby. The girl behind the counter did not look up. She was reading the same paperback novel. He noticed, this time, the title. It was a mystery. He noticed also, this time, that her bookmark had not moved from where it had been 2 weeks before. He noticed, this time, that the clock over the register said the same time it had said 2 weeks before. He did not go back to the Sinclair. After that, he tried a different fuel stop. He tried a different route. He took the Interstate North for a month and added 90 miles to his run, and his dispatcher chewed him out. And he took it, and he did not explain himself. But eventually the schedule pressed him back to the state highway, and eventually the state highway pressed him back to the long, slow bend at mile marker 287, and eventually, on a warm January night that should have been cold, he came around the bend at 2 a.m., and the fresh strip was there again, and the 6 men were there again, and he pulled up short and rolled down the window, and this time he did not call out to them. This time he looked at their boots, the boots of 6 road workers standing on a shoulder for hours in fresh asphalt work, should have been dirty, should have been tar-splattered, gravel-scuffed, worn. The 6 pairs of boots he saw that night were clean. They were black and clean and identical. They were, he realized with a slow, cold shift somewhere behind his breastbone, brand new. as if they had been taken out of a box and set down under 6 pairs of feet 10 minutes before. He looked at their hands, 6 pairs of hands hanging at 6 pairs of sides, clean, no tar, no calluses that he could see, though the light was not good. He put the truck in gear and drove through slow. He watched them in his side mirror as he went, and this time, one of them turned, slowly, as the truck passed. And when the mirror caught the front of that man's face in the red glow of the trailer's taillights, Buck saw a face he had known his entire adult life. It was his own. He drove for 200 miles before he pulled over. He pulled off at a rest stop in eastern Colorado, past midnight, no other trucks in the lot, and he sat behind the wheel and he cried, quiet, without moving, for perhaps 20 minutes. He was not a man who cried often. He had cried when his mother died in 73, and he had cried when his marriage ended in 82, and he had cried, quietly, once, on the day his daughter had gotten married, from a mixture of joy and loss that he had not entirely understood. He cried now because he understood, in a slow, reluctant way, what the road had been showing him. He was ahead of himself, or the road was behind, or both were true and neither was, and time on that stretch of prairie was not doing what time was supposed to do, and somewhere out there, in a version of the highway that had not caught up yet, a version of him was going to end up on a shoulder in dark coveralls, standing evenly spaced with 5 other versions, silent, waiting for a truck to come around the long, slow bend. He did not know how. He did not know why. He only knew the way a man knows the sound of his own daughter's voice in another room, that the face in the mirror had been his. He tried, over the following year, to change his route for good. He asked his dispatcher for the northern run, permanently. His dispatcher told him no. He asked for a different truck, different freight, different anything. His dispatcher told him no, mostly, and yes sometimes, but the road, the long 2-lane state highway across the Kansas prairie, kept finding its way back into his week. He tried refusing runs. He was written up. He was warned. He was given, in April of 95, a final warning, and he took it, and he kept driving. He tried, one time, to stop at the fresh strip and speak to the men. He put the truck in park, in the middle of the paving, and he got out, and he walked slow toward the sickest of them on the shoulder. They watched him come. They did not move. When he was 10 feet from them, he stopped and he said, "Horse, you know me, the one in the middle, the one whose face he knew now was his," lifted a hand and pointed down the road, west, the same silent gesture. "Go on." Buck said, "I am not going on, not tonight. Tonight, I am going to stand here, and I am going to wait until the sun comes up, and I am going to see what you look like in daylight." The one in the middle lowered his arm. The other 5, without any signal Buck could see, turned in a slow, smooth motion and faced east instead of the highway, and they stood that way, and Buck sat down on the fresh, warm asphalt about 6 feet from them, and he waited. The night went on a long time. The stars did not move. He watched them. He knew his stars. He knew Orion and Cassiopeia and the slow wheel of the Big Dipper. That night, in the 2nd hour and the 3rd hour and the 4th hour after he had sat down on the asphalt, none of the stars moved. Not 1 degree. He got up eventually. His knees were stiff. His back hurt. He walked back to the truck, and he got in, and he drove west, and behind him. The 6 men slowly turned back to face the road, and the fresh strip of paving hissed with its slow steam. And the stars, when he checked them again through the windshield, began to move once more, as if they had only been waiting for him to give up. He drove. He kept driving. He drove for 9 more months. He turned 59 that summer. His daughter had a baby, a girl, and he drove down to Wichita and held the baby and cried again, a small, quiet cry, and drove back to his truck. In the autumn of '95, he came around the long, slow bend at mile marker 287 for what he would later think of as the last time. The fresh strip was there. The 6 men were there. But this time, the middleman was not standing on the shoulder. The middleman was standing in the road, in the truck's lane, directly in the beams of the headlights. His arms were at his sides. He was not gesturing. He was only standing and looking at Buck through the windshield, and his face, in the full white wash of the high beams, was Buck's own face, exact and complete, and it was tired. Buck stopped the truck. He sat behind the wheel and looked at himself standing in the road. The version of him in the road looked back. Neither one moved for a long time. Then the version of him in the road lifted a hand, slow, and gestured, not west, but at the driver's door of the truck. The gesture said, "Plain as day, come out." Buck understood. He turned the truck off. He set the parking brake. He clipped the little photograph of his daughter off the sun visor and put it in his shirt pocket. He got out. He walked around to the front of the truck. The version of him in the road stepped aside, calm and polite, and walked around Buck in a slow half circle and climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door. The truck started. The truck pulled away west, slow and steady, and the tail lights receded into the prairie dark, and Buck stood on the fresh, warm asphalt with 5 silent men on the shoulder and watched his own truck drive away with his own hands on the wheel. One of the men on the shoulder, not the middle one, that spot was empty now, held out a folded set of dark coveralls. Buck took them. He said, "How long?" The man did not answer. He put the coveralls on over his jeans. They fit. He walked to the shoulder. He stood in the middle spot, the empty one, and he faced the road. The other 5 men rearranged themselves gently around him, evenly spaced and settled, and became still. Buck stood in the line. He watched the road. A long time passed. He could not have said how long. The stars did not move. The prairie was quiet. There was, somewhere very far off, the low rising sound of a diesel engine coming. He watched the long, slow bend to the east. After a while, headlights swept around it. A tractor trailer, moving at a good clip, hauling dry freight. The driver stood on the brake. The trailer settled with a slow, deep hiss. The truck came to a stop maybe 40 yards short of the crew, and the driver sat behind the wheel with his hands on it, and the crew stood on the shoulder, and no one moved for what felt like a long time. The driver, from where Buck was standing, was a big man with a broad, flat face and small, careful eyes. He was 58 years old. He wore a plain gray work shirt. There was a small photograph clipped to his sun visor. The driver rolled his window down. He called out, "Horse, you boys all right out here." Buck, standing in the line, felt his own arm rise slow. He watched it from a great distance as it lifted and pointed west down the fresh strip of steaming asphalt, and the gesture said, "Plain as day, go on. Keep going." He wanted to call out. He wanted to say, "Turn around. Take the interstate. Don't come back to this road. Don't ever come back." His mouth did not open. The other 5 men beside him were still and evenly spaced, and their coveralls were dark, and their caps were unmarked, and their faces, under the brims, were smooth in the way a face is smooth when the details have not quite committed. The truck slowly rolled forward onto the fresh paving. The tires made a soft, sticky sound. As it passed the crew on the shoulder, the driver did not turn his head. He only drove, staring west, gripping the wheel, and in the truck's side mirror, he glimpsed the crew already receding behind him, evenly still, evenly quiet. Buck watched the taillights recede. He knew, watching them, that the driver would drive on, that the driver would fuel up at a Sinclair in Colby, where a young girl behind the counter would not look up from her paperback novel, that the driver would return down this same highway in 3 nights, and the fresh strip would be gone, that 2 weeks after that it would be back, and that in a year, in less than a year, that same driver would stand where Buck was standing now, and hand a folded set of dark coveralls to the next one and take his place in the line. He knew this the way a man knows the sound of his own daughter's voice in another room. The prairie was quiet. The stars did not move. Somewhere far to the west, a set of tail lights disappeared over the low horizon, small and red and steady, and Buck lowered his arm and settled his boots evenly on the shoulder and became still and waited for the next long, slow bend to be turned by the next set of headlights at the next appointed hour. On the road he had paved himself and would pave again and again. Story 5. This story sat in my journal for 40 years before I understood it. A cemetery groundskeeper, an old black man named Owen Threlkeld, told me the bones of it in the summer of 1950, when I was still a young man on my first mail route, and it took me until I was gray to understand what he had been telling me. I will try to tell it right. His name was Owen Threlkeld. He was 39 years old in the summer of 1934, and he was the groundskeeper of a small private cemetery on the grounds of a ruined plantation house in the low country of South Carolina. And on a hot, still Thursday afternoon that summer, he was pushing a wheelbarrow of cut grass along the row of family stones when he glanced up at the great house and saw a face pressed to the second-floor window that should not have been there. The house had been empty for 11 years. Its last owner, a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Ravencourt, had died in the influenza in 22, and the family had scattered, and the property had passed into a trust that paid Owen a small sum every quarter to keep the cemetery cut, and the paths cleared, and the iron gate oiled. He did not go inside the house. He had not been asked to. The trust's letter, when it had first arrived at his small shotgun cabin on the far side of the pecan grove, had been specific. Grounds only, not the house. He had kept to that letter for 11 years. He had kept to it because he was a man who kept to letters. His mother, who had raised him in the same little settlement down the road, had raised him on a small handful of rules, and one of them was that a man does what he says he will do, and does not do what he says he will not do, and does not have opinions in either direction about it. The trust had said, grounds only, so Owen kept grounds only. He did not resent it. He did not wonder about it. He simply worked. His work was slow and precise. In the spring he raked winter debris from the paths and swept the little walled cemetery clean. In the summer he mowed the family plot with a hand-push mower, one careful row at a time, and pulled crabgrass from the joints of the flagstones and washed the stones themselves with a soft brush and rainwater from a barrel at the corner of the wall. In the fall he raked leaves. In the winter, he did what a southern groundskeeper does in a southern winter, which is not much. He checked the gate hinges for rust, he swept the paths, and he sat on the low bench by the wall and drank hot coffee out of a tin thermos and watched the light change over the pecan grove. The plantation itself did not employ him. He had never met a Ravencourt in his life. The letter that had arrived at his shotgun cabin in the summer of 1923 had been written on stiff cream stationery in a neat lawyer's hand, and it had been signed by a Mr. J. B. Purdy of Charleston, and it had come with a small ledger book and a bank draft and a set of keys. The keys were for the cemetery gate and the outbuildings. There was no key for the main house. He had understood the omission at the time as an ordinary practical matter. The house was locked. The padlocked front door had made that plain, and the trust did not require him to enter, and therefore there was no key. It had not, in 23, occurred to him that a house might be locked as much to keep something in as to keep somebody out. The little settlement down the road where he had grown up was a village of perhaps 40 souls, mostly older, mostly black, mostly the descendants of the people who had once been enslaved on the plantation itself. The village had a general store and a small clapboard church and a one-room school that met 3 days a week for the youngest children. Owen had gone to the school. He had learned to read from a Bible and a McGuffey reader and a stack of old newspapers his mother had saved. He had done well. He had liked words. He had, for a while, considered going up north to try for more schooling, but his mother had fallen ill in 21, and he had stayed to look after her. And by the time she was gone, he was married to Delphine. And by the time Delphine was gone, the years had passed him by, and he was 34 years old and a groundskeeper. And he did not, at that point, mind being one. The older women in the settlement told stories about the plantation. Owen had known these stories since childhood, though he had not, until the summer of 34, paid them any close mind. They said the Ravencourt family had come down from Virginia in 1822 and had built the big house out of local heart pine and imported brick, and had raised cotton and rice on the low land for 2 generations before the war. They said the family had lost most of its money in the war, as the plantation families had, but had held onto the house and the land through the long, slow decades after, by selling off small parcels to neighboring farmers, and by living, in the last generation, on the modest interest of what the widow Ravencourt's father had put in a Charleston bank. They said the widow had married late, to a man 20 years her senior, who had died within a decade, and that she had had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy had grown up and gone west and had not been heard from after 1890. The girl had stayed home and had grown into a strange, quiet woman in her 30s, and had gone missing in the summer of 1893, and had never been found. The older women disagreed about what had happened to her. Some said she had run off with the suitor who had come courting that summer. Some said the suitor had killed her and buried her in the pecan grove. Some said, quieter, that the widow herself had killed her in a fit of grief or rage, and had walled her into a wall of the house, and that the wall of the house was why the house had never sold, and why the trust kept it locked. Owen had heard all of these stories, and had believed none of them, and had not, in 11 years of groundskeeping, ever felt any need to sort them out. Then he saw the face at the window, that first evening, back at his cabin, sitting on his porch smoking his pipe. He thought hard about the stories. He tried to lay them out in his mind, the way a man lays out cards in a game of solitaire, and see which of them, if any, would fit the shape of a pale, slender woman pressing her palms and her face to a second-floor pane in a house that had stood empty 11 years. He could not make any of them fit exactly, but he could see that all of them had, at their center, the same missing daughter. And he could see that the missing daughter, if she had never left the house, would have to be somewhere in it, and that a somewhere in it that overlooked the cemetery and the long oak avenue was, geographically, a second-floor bedroom on the north side. He did not go up to the house that night. He was not ready. He needed to think. He sat with his pipe, and he watched the light drain from the sky over the pecan grove, and he thought about Delphine. He had not thought about her in any focused way in some time. He had thought about her, in fact, so many times over the years that the thinking had worn itself smooth, like a coin in a pocket, and had become something he did not so much think as carry. But that night, for some reason, he took the coin out and looked at it. He remembered her hands. He remembered her laugh. He remembered the day she had told him she was pregnant, standing at their little wood stove with a spoon in her hand, and the way she had grinned at him, sideways, before she said the words. He remembered the long bad night at the end, and the small silent shape of the baby, and the sound Delphine had made when she understood, and then the long, slow morning after, when she had also, quietly, gone. He remembered, too, that he had sat with her body for 6 hours before the women from the settlement came to prepare her. He had sat in a wooden chair beside the bed, holding her hand, saying her name aloud from time to time. He had told her, at one point quite plainly, that she could go now, that it was all right, that he would be all right, that she did not need to stay for him. He had not known, at the time, whether that was a thing that mattered, but he had said it. Because his mother had once told him, when he was a boy, that the dead sometimes did not know they were dead, and that a kind person would speak to them plain, and let them know the year, and let them know they were free to go. He thought about that now on his porch, in the summer of 1934, with a small yellow moon coming up over the pecan grove. He thought, quiet, well, all right, there is a woman in a window who does not know the year, and there is nobody left in that house to tell her. And if my mother was right, and my mother was often right, then somebody has to. He knocked out his pipe. He went inside. He slept, uneasy, and dreamed of a long oak avenue in a low orange evening, and of a woman standing at the head of it in a dark, high-collared dress, waiting. In the morning he did not quite yet go into the house. He did his usual work. He mowed the eastern row. He raked the paths. He checked the iron gate. He looked up once at the north window, and the face was there, palms flat, mouth slightly open, and he lifted his hat again, and again she did not react. He did the same thing on the Saturday and the Sunday. He understood, working himself up to it. On the Monday morning he came out of his cabin, and he checked the coffee pot on the stove, and he ate a piece of cornbread, and he put on his straw hat, and he walked down the shell road to the plantation grounds. But this time, before he crossed the oak avenue to the cemetery, he stopped and he looked at the great house, and he said, quiet, so quiet only he could hear it, "All right, ma'am, I am coming today. You wait for me. I am coming today, and I will sit with you a while." He said this out of pure Southern politeness, the way a man announces himself at a door. He did not quite expect it to make a difference, but when he glanced up at the second-floor window, the pale face there tilted very slightly in acknowledgment, and her mouth, which had hung open in the same small oval every day since he first saw her, closed, and she nodded. Once, and then she was still again. He stood a long moment. He took a breath. He went to work. He would finish his morning row first. A man does his work first. Then he did what he had to do. He worked the eastern row of stones at his usual careful pace. He did not rush. He had never rushed a row in 11 years, and he was not going to rush one today, because he had made an appointment with a dead woman at a window. He mowed. He pulled crabgrass from the flagstone joints. He swept clippings into his wheelbarrow. He wiped the pale marble surface of the widow Ravencourt's own stone with a soft brush, and the dates on it, 1849 to 1922, came up bright under his hand, and he thought, "Quiet. You will forgive me, ma'am. I know I was told grounds only. But your daughter is still at the window, and I do not think you can have wanted that in the end. I do not think any mother could have wanted that." He worked until the sun was high and hot over the pecan grove. He ate his lunch, cornbread, buttermilk, under the biggest live oak. He looked up at the second-floor window. She was there. She had waited. Her mouth was closed now, and it stayed closed, and he understood that this was her way of telling him that she was ready. He rose from under the tree. He brushed the crumbs from his lap. He picked up his straw hat, and he walked, slow and steady, up the long oak avenue toward the porch, and this time the walk did not feel as strange to him as it had the first time. His feet knew where he was going. His hands knew what to do. He was a man walking to sit with someone who had been alone a very long time, and there is, in the end, only one way to do that walk, and every man who has ever done it has walked the same way. Owen was a lean man with strong shoulders and quiet hands. He wore a wide straw hat in the summer and a plain wool coat in the winter. He lived alone in the shotgun cabin, and he had lived alone in that cabin since his wife, a woman named Delphine, had died in childbirth in 28, and the baby with her. He did not talk much. He did not need to. The cemetery was his company. He knew all the names on the stones. He kept them clean. The plantation itself was not much anymore. The main house was a big 3-story Greek revival, half white with peeling paint, its columns sagging, its porch caved in on the north side, its roof missing shingles in a long strip down the east slope. The outbuildings were mostly gone. The kitchen house, the smokehouse, the row of small dwellings where the enslaved had lived 100 years before had been pulled down or fallen down. What remained was the big house, half standing, and the little walled cemetery 100 yards to its east, and a long avenue of live oaks hung with Spanish moss between them. Owen kept the avenue clear. Owen kept the cemetery cut. Owen did not go inside the house. He looked up that Thursday afternoon in July, and he saw the face at the second-floor window, and he stopped pushing the wheelbarrow, and he set the handles down slow, and he looked. The face was a woman's face. She was pressed to the glass. Her nose was flattened against the pane. Her palms were flat against the glass on either side of her head, fingers spread. She was looking straight at him. Her eyes were wide and steady and unblinking. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she had just spoken a word. He had never seen her before. She was, from his distance, perhaps 40 years old. Her hair was pinned up. Her dress, so far as he could make out through the wavy old glass, was a dark, high-collared thing that might have been fashionable in 1890 and was long out of fashion by 1934. She was pale, not sick pale, not dead pale. Only, he thought, the pale of a woman who had not been in the sun for a very long time. He stood a long moment. She did not move. He raised his hand, slow, and lifted his straw hat. Out of politeness, he said, quiet, to himself, but loud enough that if the wind had been right, she might have heard him, ma'am. She did not react. She only pressed against the glass. He put his hat back on. He picked up the wheelbarrow. He kept working. He finished the row of family stones, and he emptied the wheelbarrow at the compost heap beyond the cemetery wall. And he did his last check of the iron gate, and he walked down the long oak avenue to the road and back to his cabin. And the whole time he did not look at the second-floor window again, though he could feel quite plainly that the face was still there. That night he sat on the little porch of his cabin and smoked a pipe and thought. He had lived near the ruined plantation for 21 years. He had walked its grounds 5 days a week for 11 of them. He had never once, in all that time, seen a face at any of its windows. He had heard, from older folks in the little black settlement down the road, stories about the place, stories about the widow Ravencourt, about her one daughter who had gone missing in 1893, about a fire in the West Wing in 1901, about the influenza in 22. He had listened to the stories the way a polite man listens to stories that do not concern him. He thought, now, that they might concern him after all. The next morning was a Friday. Owen went to the cemetery at his usual hour. He worked slow and steady, the way he always did. He did not look at the house until he had finished the eastern row of stones, and then he lifted his head, and the face was still there. Same window, same position, palms flat against the glass, mouth slightly open, eyes wide and steady. He worked through the morning. He looked up again at noon. Still there, he ate his lunch under the biggest of the live oaks, a piece of cornbread and a jar of buttermilk. He looked up again after. Still there. At 3 in the afternoon, he pushed the wheelbarrow back to the compost heap, and he emptied it, and he stood a long moment with his hands on the handles, looking at the house. Then he set the barrow down, and he walked slow up the long oak avenue toward the big front porch of the plantation house. He had not walked up to that porch in 11 years. His feet did not want to do it. But he went. He climbed the porch steps. The wood groaned under him. The front door was closed, and there was a heavy padlock on the outside of it, hanging from a rusted iron hasp, and the padlock was as old as the trust, and had never been unlocked in Owen's time. He did not try the padlock. He stepped back down the porch steps, and he walked around the north side of the house, past the caved-in section of porch, and he found what he had suspected he might find, a ground-floor window at the back of the house, missing its glass. The frame was still there, warped and cracked, but the pane had gone long ago and had never been replaced. Ivy had grown up over it and around it, but the opening itself was clear. He stood at it a while. He looked in. The inside of the house smelled of damp wood and old paper and something else, something faint and organic, like the inside of an old shoe. The room he was looking into had once been a small parlor. There was a fireplace on the far wall, its mantel empty, its hearth full of leaves. There was a chair tipped over on its side, There was a rag rug so worn it was mostly warp and mildew. There was, above the fireplace, the pale rectangle where a portrait had once hung, and above the rectangle, still nailed to the wall, the empty hook. He put his hands on the frame. He climbed through. The house was silent. He listened. The kind of silence a house makes when no one has lived in it for a long time is not quite empty. Old timbers settle. Wind moves through cracks. Dust shifts. This house did none of that. This house was silent the way a stone is silent. There was not one breath of air in it. He walked slow, out of the parlor and into a hall. The hall had a wide staircase at its far end, curving up to the second floor, its banister still intact. He walked to the stairs. He put his hand on the banister. He climbed. The stairs did not creak. He should have expected creaking in a house that had stood empty 11 years and had been building itself for 130. There was none. The stairs were quiet and level and firm under his feet, as if they had been used every day. The second floor was a long hall with doors on either side. He counted them. 4 doors on the left, 4 on the right, and 1 at the far end. He knew, by the geometry of the house, which door he was looking for. It was the 3rd on the left. He walked to it. He put his hand on the knob. It turned. He opened it. Inside was a bedroom. There was a large 4-poster bed. There was a wardrobe. There was a small writing desk under the window. There was a rocking chair by the fireplace. There was a rag rug on the floor, in good repair, its colors still bright. There was a woman standing at the window with her palms flat against the glass and her nose pressed to the pane. She did not turn. Owen stood in the doorway. He did not step inside. He looked at her back. The dark, high-collared dress, the pinned-up hair, the pale, slender arms raised on either side of her head with the palms against the glass. He said, "Quiet, ma'am." She did not turn. He said, "Ma'am, my name is Owen. I keep the grounds. I saw you at the window yesterday, and today." She did not turn. He said, softer, "You do not have to be at the window. Ma'am, it is all right. You can come away from it." She did not turn, but her hands, very slowly, unpressed themselves from the glass, only slightly, only the pressure. The palms stayed flat, the fingers stayed spread, but the weight came off the pane. He could see, from behind, the small shift of her shoulders. He said, "That is good." He said, "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" She spoke. He almost did not hear her. She spoke so quiet, and her voice came muffled by the direction she was facing, out through the glass, out toward the cemetery and the live oaks and the world. She said, "I do not know how long I have been here." He said gently, "You have been here a long time, I think." She said, "I keep watching the road. I am waiting for someone. He said he would come back for me. He said he would come back before dark." He said, "Ma'am, may I ask what year you think it is?" She said, without any hesitation, 1893. "It is the 12th of August. He said he would come back before dark, and it is nearly dark now, and I have been at this window all afternoon." Owen was quiet a long moment. He remembered. Then the story the older women in the little settlement had told him about the widow Ravencourt's daughter who had gone missing in 1893. Gone missing was the phrase they had used. Nobody had ever said how. Nobody had ever said where. She had been a young woman, they said, of about 40, unmarried, said to be strange, said to keep to her room. There had been a suitor, briefly. There had been an argument. The suitor had left, and the daughter had gone up to her room, and after that no one had ever quite been able to say what had happened to her. He looked at the back of her head in the dim afternoon light of the ruined bedroom. He looked at the palms flat against the glass. He looked at the fresh, unfaded colors of the rag rug in the middle of the floor, and at the good repair of the four-poster bed, and at the small, tidy writing desk, and he understood, in a slow, reluctant way, that inside this one room, on this one floor of this one dying house, the year was still 1893, and had been for 41 years, and the daughter of the widow Ravencourt had been waiting at that window that whole time for a man who was not going to come back. He said, "Ma'am." She did not turn. He said, "Ma'am, may I sit with you a while?" She said, "Quiet, all right." He came into the room. He did not go to the window. He did not want to look out of that window, from her side of it. He sat instead in the rocking chair by the fireplace, and he took his straw hat off, and he set it on his knee, and he waited. He sat with her a long time. She stood at the window. He sat in the chair. The light through the window went from bright afternoon to slanting late afternoon to the long orange of a low country evening, and she did not move, and he did not move, and neither of them spoke. And there was between them a kind of quiet that was not uncomfortable, only long. When the light was almost gone, she said, softer than before, "Do you think he is coming?" He said, "No, ma'am, I do not think he is." She said, "I did not think so either." He said, "Ma'am, I have to ask you a hard question, and I do not want to hurt you." She said, "Ask it." He said, "Ma'am, how did you come to be at the window?" She was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "He came back to the house after our argument. He came back only for an hour. He was very sorry. He kissed me at the front door, and he said he had to ride into town to see his father, and he would be back before dark, and we would leave the house together and be married in Charleston within the week. And I went up to my room to pack, and I was so happy and so foolish, and I stood at this window to watch for him coming back, and I put my hands flat on the glass, and I pressed my face there, and I watched." She said, "And I have been watching since." He said, "Quiet, ma'am. Do you know that a long time has gone by?" She said, "No, it has been an afternoon." He said, "Ma'am, it has been 41 years. She was quiet. He said, "Your mother lived another 29 years in this house, ma'am. She died in the influenza. The house has stood empty since. I have kept the grounds. I have never come inside until today. I only came inside today because I saw your face at the glass from the cemetery." She was quiet. She said, at last, "Then he did not come back at all." He said, "No, ma'am, I do not believe he did." She said, softly, "Then what am I still doing here?" He rocked in the chair. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. He said, "Ma'am, I think you have been waiting, and I think the waiting has held you here. I think you did not know how to stop. I think nobody came in this room in 41 years to tell you it was all right to stop." She was quiet a long time. Then, very slowly, she took her palms off the glass. She lowered them, and she flexed her fingers, and she looked at them a moment, at her own two hands, as if she had almost forgotten they belonged to her. She turned, slow, from the window. She faced him. Her face, from the front, was as he had seen it from below, pale, still unblinking. But now, in the low orange light of the low country evening, she looked, he thought, tired. Only that, tired. The way any woman is tired at the end of a long day of waiting. She said, "You are a kind man." He said, "No, ma'am, I am only the groundskeeper." She smiled. It was a small, tired smile, and it was the first movement he had seen in her face at all. She said, "Would you sit with me until it is dark?" He said, "Yes, ma'am, I will." He sat. She stood, and then, after a while, she sat too, on the edge of the four-poster bed, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything more. And outside the window, the low country evening drained slowly from orange to blue to black, and when it was full dark, he stood up from the rocking chair, and he set his straw hat on his head, and he said quietly, "Good night, ma'am." She said, "Good night." He walked out of the room. He walked down the long hall. He walked down the wide, curving stairs, and out through the parlor with the missing window, and around the north side of the house, and down the long oak avenue, and back to his cabin. He did not look back at the house. The next morning he went to the cemetery at his usual hour. He worked slow and steady. When he was finished with the eastern row of stones, he lifted his head, cautious, and he looked at the second-floor window on the north side of the great house. There was no face at the window. The glass was empty. The pane reflected only the sky. He went inside the house one more time that summer in September to check. He climbed the stairs. He walked to the third door on the left. He opened it. The rocking chair was there, and the writing desk, and the wardrobe, and the four-poster bed. The rag rug on the floor was faded and moth-eaten, its colors mostly gone. The bed was bare. The wardrobe was empty. Dust lay thick on every surface, thick and undisturbed, as if it had been settling for 41 years without interruption, and no one at all had walked in that room in all that time. He stood a long moment in the doorway. He said, "Quiet. Rest well, ma'am." Then he closed the door, and he walked out of the house for the last time, and he did not go back. He kept the cemetery for another 31 years, until his own body would not do the work any more. And when he was 70 years old, he sat with me at the edge of his little porch on a summer evening in 1950, and he told me all of this in that quiet, steady voice of his. And when he was done, he was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "You know, son, I have thought about her many times since, about what held her at that window, about what let her go." I asked him, "Quiet, what do you think it was?" He said, "I think it was somebody sitting with her, somebody willing to sit with her long enough to say the year out loud. That is all. That is all it takes, sometimes, to let the person stop waiting." He said, "And I have wondered all my life how many other houses have somebody at the window, somebody still waiting, somebody who does not know that the afternoon has run out, and the road is empty, and the man they are watching for is not coming, and the year is not the year they think it is." He said, softly, "I hope somebody sits with each of them in time." He said, "I hope somebody sits with me." I did not know then what he meant. I was a young man on my first mail route, and I had a long life ahead of me, and I did not sit long with anyone. I said good night to Owen Threlkeld on his porch, and I walked to my truck, and I drove away. He died the following winter, alone in his shotgun cabin, of a bad cold that turned to pneumonia. They found him 3 days after. He was in his rocking chair by his front window with his palms resting on the arms of the chair, and his face was turned toward the road, as if he had been waiting. I have thought about that many times since. I have thought, in the long, slow years of my own age, about all the windows in all the empty houses, in all the small towns of this country, and about the pale, patient faces that might be pressed to the inside of some of those windows, waiting for someone to come up an avenue of live oaks in the low orange light of a long summer evening. I have thought more than I care to admit about my own windows, but that story, at least, is not for tonight. Tonight I will only tell you what Owen Threlkeld told me at the end of his life on the porch of his cabin in the summer of 1950. He said somebody has to sit with them. That is all it takes, and I have tried since, in my own small ways, to be that somebody when I can. Because you never know, friend. You never know when you glance up at a second-floor window in a house you thought was empty, whose face might be pressed to the inside of the glass. And you never know how long they have been waiting. And you never know how much of their long waiting could have ended a great deal sooner if someone had only come up the stairs and taken off his hat and sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace and been willing for one long evening to say the year out loud. The fire's down to embers now, friend. The rain outside hasn't quieted, and I don't reckon it will before morning. If you're still with me, let your eyes close. If you slipped off somewhere back in the middle of it all, I hope the dreams were soft ones. I'll be right here tomorrow night. Same chair, same fire, same old rain on the tin roof. Come find me again. Sleep well now, friend. Sleep long and sleep gentle.